It shattered. What followed was not peace. It was not order. It was a long, exhausting silence broken only by violence. Across the Iranian plateau, no single ruler commanded loyalty. No capital spoke with authority. No crown was accepted as legitimate. Power had fallen into the hands of tribes. Turkmen confederations carved the land like hunters dividing a carcass. The Karakoyun, the Aqkoyunlu, their banners rose and fell with the seasons. Battles were not fought for nations. They were fought for pasture, prestige, and revenge. Cities survived by bargaining. Villages survived by hiding. Merchants paid twice, once in taxes, once in blood. Every road was dangerous. Every border uncertain. Every promise temporary. This was not chaos by accident. It was chaos by exhaustion. For nearly 2 centuries, Persia had been invaded, burned, and ruled by outsiders, Mongols, Turks, warlords who governed with swords instead of systems. Institutions collapsed first, then memory followed. People still spoke Persian. They still remembered ancient kings. But memory alone could not hold a country together. Something deeper was missing. Legitimacy. In this vacuum, brute force ruled, but only briefly. Tribal power was strong in battle, weak in peace. A confederation could conquer a city, but it could not command loyalty beyond its tents. The land needed something stronger than armies. It needed belief. History shows this pattern again and again. When politics fails, ideology enters. When law collapses, faith steps forward. And in late medieval Persia, faith was not quiet. It was emotional, it was militant, it was ready to be weaponized. Across villages and towns, Sufi orders spread like underground rivers. Mystical brotherhoods. Charismatic leaders. Poetry mixed with prophecy. They offered what rulers could not: meaning, belonging, certainty. In a world without order, they promised divine purpose. In a land without kings, they offered sacred authority. One such order lived far from the centers of power, in the town of Ardabil. At first, they were harmless. A spiritual family, teachers, ascetics. But generations passed, and something changed. The message hardened. The devotion intensified. The followers became soldiers. Red headgear appeared, 12 folds, 12 a visual declaration of belief. They called themselves the Kizilbash. To them, faith was not private. It was absolute. They believed their leader was chosen by God, protected by destiny, bound to rule. This was not Sunni Islam as practiced by the empires around them. This was something sharper. Twelver Shi'ism transformed from theology into identity. In a region dominated by Sunni powers, this belief was dangerous. But danger was the point. Because belief does something armies cannot. It creates loyalty beyond reason. It turns followers into martyrs. It makes death meaningful. In a broken land, this was revolutionary. While tribal rulers fought over territory, the Safavid order, not yet a dynasty, fought over souls. And souls last longer than borders. What Persia was about to witness was not just the rise of a new ruler. It was the construction of a new state, built not on ancestry alone, but on sacred conviction. A state where faith would define politics, where belief would enforce unity, where identity would be chosen, not inherited. Before Iran existed, an idea was being forged. An idea strong enough to end chaos, strong enough to challenge empires, strong enough to reshape the Middle East forever. And at its center stood a boy, barely a teenager, with red-capped warriors behind him, and a divine claim no one could ignore. His name was Ismail, and the world was not ready for what he would unleash. Long before the Safavid Dynasty ruled Persia, before the walls of Isfahan could glint under the sun, before the banners of the Kizilbash flew over the plains, there was Ardabil, a quiet town on the edge of empires, nestled among cold, misty mountains. It was neither rich nor powerful, but it had something else, something intangible, something that would shape the destiny of a nation. It had faith. The Safavid order began as a spiritual movement. A quiet circle of Sufi mystics who wandered the countryside in simple robes, carrying prayer beads and teachings older than the empires that surrounded them. They spoke of divine love, of purification of the soul, of submission to God. For decades, they were nothing more than teachers, guides, spiritual healers. Among them, 2 names became legendary: Junaid and Haydar. Junaid was the scholar, the philosopher, the man who interpreted the mystical visions of his predecessors. He spoke of union with God not as a dream, but as a practice. His followers revered him, not because he wielded power, but because he seemed to channel something far greater than himself. To be near him was to feel the pulse of the divine, to see the world as it could be when ordinary men lived in extraordinary harmony. Then came Haydar, Junaid's grandson, whose life would mark the turning point of the order. He was born in turbulent times, when Persia was a patchwork of tribes, empires, and warlords. The land outside Ardabil was not gentle. Every year, armies clashed over pastures, cities changed hands with the seasons, and ordinary people survived by cleverness, not law. Haydar learned early that mysticism alone would not protect his people. Faith, to survive, had to be sharpened like a blade. Under Junaid, the order had preached patience and prayer. Under Haydar, they learned a different language, that of discipline, arms, and obedience. Junaid had nurtured the spirit. Haydar nurtured warriors. The quiet Sufi gatherings began to resemble military councils. Meditation turned into drills. Devotion turned into loyalty to a leader whose word was law, whose charisma bound hearts stronger than any fortress. It was not a conscious decision at first. It was necessity. Persia demanded it. Tribes like the Aq Koyunlu were growing in strength, consolidating territories, claiming the allegiance of cities. The order could not exist in isolation. Ardabil, though revered as a spiritual hub, was a small town in the shadow of these empires. Its leaders could not simply pray and hope. They needed followers who could defend the teachings, the order, and themselves. This transformation was not gentle. Many Sufi students struggled with the new discipline. Some left, unwilling to abandon purely spiritual life. Others embraced it, believing that their devotion had a purpose far beyond ordinary existence. For the first time, mysticism became militant, and in this fusion of faith and force, the Safavid order found its power. Haydar's charisma was undeniable. He was not just a teacher, he was a storm. His words could inspire, terrify, or console, sometimes all at once. He spoke of martyrdom not as a tragedy, but as a choice. To die for faith was to ascend beyond the ordinary world, to join a lineage of heroes chosen by God. His followers, now known as Qizilbash, began wearing their red headgear, 12 folds, 12 imams, a visible declaration of loyalty, identity, and blood-bound destiny. It was not just clothing, it was armor for the soul. Conflict with the surrounding tribes was inevitable. The Aq Koyunlu, a powerful Sunni Turkmen confederation, ruled much of northwestern Persia. They were experienced warriors, seasoned politicians, and proud rulers. The Safavid order, with its blend of mysticism and militancy, appeared at first as a curiosity, a small, fanatical group, unlikely to threaten established power, but they underestimated the power of belief. The first clashes were sporadic, brutal, and instructive. Haydar's followers were not many, but they were disciplined and fanatic. They did not fight for land, or wealth, or glory. They fought for a vision. And vision, in history, often trumps numbers. When the Qizilbash went into battle, they moved as one body, their red caps gleaming like a warning in the sunlight. Every wound was sanctified. Every death was a lesson. Every victory was proof that God had chosen them. This was where martyrdom became propaganda. Every follower who fell was celebrated, their story told and retold to inspire new generations. Death was not an end, but a tool, a weapon to forge unity, loyalty, and fear. Ordinary men, inspired by extraordinary conviction, began joining the order. Families sent sons, believing it an honor to be part of something eternal. Villagers who once fled from conflict now approached it with reverence. In this crucible, a bloodline was being forged, not of kings or nobles, but of warriors sanctified by faith. Haydar himself bore scars from the battlefield, each one a symbol of both personal sacrifice and divine favor. He taught his followers that suffering was a mark of worthiness, that the world was chaotic because God's plan was unfolding, and that only through discipline, devotion, and blood could the divine vision be realized. The order expanded, slowly but surely. Ardabil became the epicenter of a movement that extended its influence beyond its humble borders. Spiritual schools flourished, funded not only by devotion but by tribute from local villages. Pilgrims came seeking wisdom, advice, or protection. Every visit spread the legend. Every story strengthened the narrative. The Safavids were not merely mystics. They were a force of destiny. The political dimension was subtle at first. Haydar did not claim kingship. He did not demand loyalty to the state. Instead, he demanded loyalty to himself as a guide, a teacher, and a living link to the divine. And in a land where loyalty had been fleeting, this was revolutionary. Ordinary tribesmen, who had known only shifting allegiances, now devoted themselves to a higher purpose. Their obedience became absolute. Their faith became political without being labeled as such. Even the neighboring rulers noticed. The Aq Koyunlu could no longer dismiss Ardabil as a minor town. Reports of battles lost to a small, fanatical force began circulating. Tribes began defecting, drawn by the promise of divine favor and security under Haydar's leadership. Villages pledged allegiance not to empires, but to the order. The Safavids were becoming a shadow state, invisible but potent. And yet, the transformation was not without peril. Every move towards militarization risked fracturing the spiritual integrity of the order. Some critics within whispered that the order was abandoning God for the sword. Haydar silenced dissent with a mix of charisma, discipline, and subtle terror. He taught that violence, when sanctioned by faith, was not sin. It was sanctity. Every act of war became an act of devotion, every conquest an expression of divine will. This philosophy would define the Safavid Dynasty for centuries. The fusion of faith and force, of mysticism and militancy, of vision and violence, became the blueprint for what was to come. And at the heart of it all was a lesson repeated across ages. In times of chaos, only belief can create order. and belief, when wielded like a sword, can carve history itself. By the time Haydar died, the order had been transformed. Ardabil was no longer a simple town. It was a crucible. It was a proving ground. It had produced warriors, martyrs, and leaders. And most importantly, it had produced a lineage, a bloodline that would claim both divine authority and political power. His son, Ismail, inherited not only leadership of the order, but a vision of destiny, a vision soaked in blood, faith, and inevitability. He was young, barely a teenager, but he carried within him the combined weight of centuries of mysticism, struggle, and preparation. The stage was set. The Safavid Dynasty, born from Sufi mystics who had learned to kill, was ready to step onto the world stage, and the world would never be the same again. The mountains of Ardabil were silent that morning. Mist curled like ghosts around the tents where the followers of Haydar had once trained, prayed, and bled. But silence does not last in history. In the blink of an eye, the fragile order of Sufi warriors that had survived decades of turmoil felt the world tilt beneath them. Haydar, the father of the order, the man who had turned mystics into soldiers, was dead. It was not a violent death on the battlefield, though his life had been defined by them. No, he died in confinement, a prisoner of enemies who resented his power, who feared the force that had emerged from Ardabil. His followers were scattered. Some fled into the mountains, others hid among villages, and a few, driven only by loyalty and devotion, chose martyrdom over life. Among them was a boy named Ismail. He was barely 10 years old. His hair was dark, his eyes sharp and unnerving, and already he carried the weight of destiny that most adults could not comprehend. In the shadows of his father's death, Ismail was told something that would shape every thought, every action, every choice he would ever make. He was not merely a boy. He was divine, chosen, destined to rule. At first it was a whisper, a rumor carried on the lips of surviving Khazars. He is the descendant of Ali. The blood of the prophet runs through him. The world will bow, but whispers become commands. Commands become truth. And in the twisted corridors of exile and fear, Ismail came to believe it himself. The collapse of the Safavid order left the boy vulnerable. He was captured by enemies, held prisoner in the courts of rival tribes, the very same people his father had fought. Yet Ismail survived, though it was a survival carved from cunning, patience, and sheer luck. Days blurred into weeks. Hunger gnawed at his bones, loneliness gnawed at his mind. But through it all, the elders whispered his destiny into the emptiness of his cell, their voices threading prophecy into his consciousness like a needle through cloth. He would not remain imprisoned for long. A small group of loyal followers, remnants of Haydar's Kizilbash, staged a daring rescue. They carried him across rivers and mountains, through forests that were dark with wolves and brigands, into the province of Gilan. Here, along the Caspian Sea, he would spend the next decade of his life, exiled, protected, indoctrinated. Gilan was a world apart from Ardabil. The air was damp, thick with the smell of pine and salt water. The villages were small, the people wary of strangers. But it was here, in these hiding places, that Ismail's education began. Not merely education in reading or writing, but in the language of kings, of war, of prophecy. Every morning, he was taught the history of his lineage, the glories of Ali, the sacrifices of the imams, and the vision that the world itself was awaiting him. At night, he listened to tales of the red-capped warriors who had died for faith, stories repeated again and again to remind him that loyalty was eternal and life, fleeting. Poetry and prophecy intertwined. History became myth. Myth became reality. And the boy grew up in a world where the line between the human and the divine was deliberately blurred. Ismail learned to fight as soon as he could stand. His teachers, veteran soldiers who had survived the collapse, trained him in swordsmanship, strategy, and the art of command. But he was not just trained as a soldier, he was trained as a symbol. Every lesson, every punishment, every reward was a lesson in identity. To fail was not simply personal, it was sacrilege. To win was not simply victory, it was destiny. And destiny was a heavy weight for a child. The psychological cost of being told you are God, of being told the world must bend to your will, is not measured in years or seasons. It is measured in nights of silence, in whispers that creep into the corners of your mind, in the relentless pressure of a story you did not choose but must live. For Ismail's childhood was not a time of play, it was a forge. His innocence was stripped and recast into something sharper, something cold, something that could cut through doubt. He learned diplomacy as a weapon, too. Every visitor, every messenger, every rival was a puzzle. Was he a friend, a spy, a traitor? His teachers drilled into him the knowledge of politics before he could understand friendship. Letters became lessons in persuasion. Alliances became lessons in trust and betrayal. And all the while, the voice of destiny whispered, "You are the chosen. The world is waiting." Faith became inseparable from identity. The red cap of the Kizilbash, once a symbol of belonging, became a crown of conscience. Every follower who came to him believed in his divinity. Every story of past martyrs reinforced his self, and gradually, even the boy began to forget the ordinary world, the world where children played in the streets, where fathers laughed, where rulers were merely human. he became something else, something larger, something terrifying in its intensity. And yet, he was still a child. Even kings, even saints, even generals carry the ghost of their childhood. In the quiet of Gilan's forests, Ismail sometimes wept, not for himself, but for the weight of expectations, not for the lost fathers or scattered families, but for the immense loneliness of being told you are divine. Some nights, he wondered if the whispers were lies. Some nights, he wondered if the blood of the prophet truly flowed in his veins, or if it was just the imagination of desperate men clinging to hope. But doubt was dangerous, and in a world still ruled by tribal violence, survival demanded certainty. So he learned to suppress the child within, to wrap it in stories of heroism and prophecy. Poetry taught him patience. Prophecy taught him focus. History taught him ruthlessness. By the time he was 13, Ismail had mastered not only sword and strategy, but also myth. He could recite lineages backward and forward, trace every claim of divine ancestry, quote the battles of Ali, and interpret the signs of heaven with unnerving precision. Every story he told reinforced his own identity. Every gesture he made became legend in the making. Yet the world beyond Gilan was not idle. The Aq Koyunlu still controlled large swaths of Persia. The Timurids had faded but left chaos in their wake. Mercenaries and warlords roamed the plains. And in this chaos, the boy who was told he was God was being prepared to emerge, to claim what his father had begun, to turn faith into empire, to convert prophecy into politics. Education for Ismail was not confined to walls or books. Every day was a battlefield. Every encounter a test, and every test reinforced the message. You are more than human. You are the spear through the heart of chaos. You are the chosen. You are the world's reckoning. The psychological cost was immense. His peers were absent. He had no ordinary friendships, no ordinary joys, no ordinary life. Play was punishment, rest was unnecessary, and laughter was dangerous. Every moment was a rehearsal for destiny, and yet, through it all, he survived, not merely survived, but thrived. The boy's mind, sharpened by trauma and myth-making, became the mind of a leader who could command armies, inspire devotion, and manipulate perception. By the time the loyal followers deemed him ready, Ismail was no longer just a boy. He was a figure of legend in the making. Tales of his miraculous survival, his divine lineage, and his mastery of prophecy had spread even among rival tribes. Ordinary men whispered his name with fear. Poets sang of his destiny. And in the forests and hills of Gilan, the boy who had been told he was God began to understand the terrifying truth. The world would believe in him if he believed in himself. And he did. Because to survive, to rule, and to remake Persia, he had no choice. In the next decade, the foundations laid in these years of exile, indoctrination, and preparation would explode into conquest. The Safavid order, once a small Sufi sect, would transform into an empire. The red caps of the Kizilbash would march across Persia. Cities would fall. Thrones would be claimed. And at the heart of it all, the boy, now more than boy, now myth and man intertwined, would carry the weight of a nation. The expectations of God, and the memory of every life sacrificed for his destiny. This was the making of Ismail I, the first Shah of Persia. The boy who was told he was God had survived the impossible, and the world would soon witness that survival as power, as blood, as empire. The plains of Persia had never seen anything like them. They came in waves of red, a living tide moving over hills, through valleys, and across rivers. Their banners flapped like blood against the sky. Their cries echoed like thunder. And in the hearts of those who faced them, fear came before reason, before strategy, before hope. They were the Kizilbash, the red-headed ones. At first glance, they were merely a tribal army, drawn from the Turkmen tribes of Anatolia, Azerbaijan, and northern Persia. They rode horses small but fierce, their arms simple yet lethal, spears, swords, and bows. No elephants, no siege engines, no numbers that could truly intimidate the seasoned generals of their enemies. Yet the Kizilbash were something else, something the old world had rarely seen. They were believers in motion, faith made flesh and steel. Who were these men? They were sons of nomads, hunters, herders, men used to cold winters and fierce competition. Their loyalties had always been personal, tribal. Bloodlines mattered more than borders, families more than empires. Yet, under Ismail, something extraordinary happened. Their tribal identity fused with faith in a single, living figure, a boy who claimed, and whom they believed, to be divine. This was not simple loyalty, it was transcendence. To follow Ismail was to surrender oneself entirely. Individual ambition, self-preservation, hesitation, all dissolved in a single, unshakable belief. The Kizilbash believed that to die for their Shah was to ascend to heaven. To fight without hesitation was to honor God. And when a man believes that death is not an end but a beginning, he can perform feats beyond ordinary human limits. And they did. The transformation began in Ardabil, in the forests and hills where Ismail had been trained. Young boys who had grown up with myths whispered into their ears became hardened warriors. Red caps marked their allegiance and reminded them constantly of the 12 Imams, the divine line, the sacred duty that bound them. Faith replaced formal discipline. The rules of war were replaced by religious fervor. Strategy was secondary. Conviction came first. Courage was instinctual. Fear had no place. Early campaigns revealed the staggering power of this psychology. Even the seasoned commanders of the AQ Koyunlu found themselves facing an enemy who did not retreat, did not negotiate, and did not fear death. A single charge by a band of Kizilbash could turn the tide of battle. Numbers became irrelevant. Technique became irrelevant. Only belief remained. A man who believed he could not die, or that death itself was divine, could break formations, shatter morale, and inspire chaos in the enemy ranks. They moved like a storm, unpredictable, unstoppable, at least at first. The famous Battle of Sharur was the first large-scale demonstration of this power. Ismail, still in his mid-teens, faced a coalition of rival tribes determined to crush him before his fame could grow. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, he relied on what others considered irrational, complete trust in his soldiers' devotion. The Kizilbash rode at dawn. Their red caps glowed in the rising sun. They chanted the names of the imams. They prayed aloud as they advanced. And when they struck as one body, one mind, one unstoppable force. Commanders on the opposing side hesitated. Confusion spread like wildfire. Fear, amplified by the strange fanaticism of their enemies, broke their formations. Those who survived the initial charge fled. Those who fought faced men who seemed invincible, guided by destiny rather than human calculation. By sunset, the plains were littered with the bodies of the defeated. Victory belonged to the Boy King and his red-headed storm. But the Kizilbash were not merely warriors. They were a psychological weapon. Their devotion created unity stronger than any chain of command. Orders were unnecessary. Initiative was divine. When one soldier faltered, the belief of the others carried him forward. When one faltered and died, he became a martyr, whose story fueled courage in the next wave. This army did not need discipline. It needed faith, and faith was absolute. In cities they conquered. Even civilians sensed something terrifying and sacred. They whispered that the boy was divine, that his soldiers could not be killed, that to resist was to invite wrath. These rumors were not just exaggeration. Every battle, every victory, every reckless charge reinforced the legend. Myth became reality in real time. The tribal nature of the Kizilbash could have been a weakness. Historically, tribal warriors often fought for personal glory, family honor, or wealth. Yet Ismail had found a way to redirect these instincts into a singular purpose. He made every tribe subordinate to faith, subordinate to the Shah, and subordinate to the larger destiny of the Safavid state. Loyalty to Ismail was more powerful than loyalty to kin. Bloodlines were sacred, but devotion to God and Shah transcended them, and this paradoxically made them unstoppable. But it also made them unpredictable. Faith cannot always be commanded. Fanaticism is wild. And when men believe they are instruments of God, they can act without reason. They can disobey, overextend, and take risks no general would authorize. This would become both their greatest strength and their eventual weakness. For now, though it was a force unlike any other in the region, stories of their bravery or madness spread faster than any letter or messenger. One tale tells of a Kizilbash warrior who charged into a formation of enemy cavalry alone, fighting until he fell, inspiring his comrades to victory. Another tells of a small band who held a mountain pass against 10 times their number, refusing retreat because they believed God had willed it. The combination of belief, brutality, and tribal loyalty created a perfect storm. Cities surrendered at the mere approach of the red-capped cavalry. Rivals fled before the army arrived. The Kizilbash seemed unstoppable because they were not ordinary men. They were zeal incarnate. Their courage was suicidal. Their devotion absolute. And their faith was weaponized in a way history rarely witnessed. Yet, even at the height of their initial victories, cracks existed beneath the surface. The very fanaticism that made them formidable also made them volatile. Tribal rivalries could flare. Old grudges, untempered by reason, sometimes erupted even in the midst of battle. Obedience to faith sometimes conflicted with obedience to strategy. Every commander had to balance inspiration with chaos, devotion with control. Ismail, still young, learned these lessons quickly. He became more than a leader. He became a psychologist. He learned when to inspire, when to intimidate, when to let fanaticism run free, and when to channel it. His genius was not merely in battlefield tactics, but in understanding the human mind, the power of belief, and the terrifying force that faith could unleash. For the moment, though the Kizilbash were unstoppable, their enemies had never faced soldiers who believed in divine protection. Empires collapsed before them, not always because of numbers or strategy, but because morale shattered in the face of the red-headed storm. Fear fed fear. Faith fed courage. Myth fed reality. In the annals of military history, few forces have combined ideology and violence so seamlessly. The Kizilbash did not fight for gold, land, or glory. They fought because they believed the world demanded it, because the boy they followed was divine, because every victory was a sermon in blood. And the boy King Ismail was learning how to harness this power, how to turn devotion into an unstoppable army. How to make belief as lethal as any sword. How to make the red-headed storm the first true army of faith in the Middle East since the Arab conquests centuries before. But fanaticism is a double-edged sword. In the coming years, the very qualities that made the Qizilbash unstoppable would also make them unpredictable. Unity was fragile. Tribal pride simmered, and armies without discipline, when confronted with greater organization and siege warfare, could falter. Yet for now, the red-headed storm swept across Persia, changing the course of history. It was an army born of mysticism and blood. An army that believed in destiny more than strategy. An army that would make the name of Ismail echo through the centuries. It was unstoppable. The forests of Gilan whispered in the cold dawn. The mist clung to the trees like spirits, and in the shadows, a young boy emerged, barely 14, but carrying centuries of prophecy on his shoulders. Ismail, the boy who had been told he was God, mounted his horse. His red-capped Qizilbash gathered around him like a tide of fire. The mountains behind them hid years of exile, of survival, of indoctrination. Ahead lay the plains, the rivers, and the cities that would test his claim to destiny. The march from Gilan was not a journey. It was a statement. Every village they passed learned the legend of the Boy King. Every town witnessed the discipline and ferocity of the red-headed army. His soldiers moved, not because of orders, but because of belief. To follow Ismail was to follow fate itself. The path south was littered with ruins and old grudges. The Aq Koyunlu, a coalition of Turkmen tribes who had ruled the north for decades, were aware of the boy who commanded devotion beyond reason. Their leaders, battle-hardened men who had fought kings and generals, underestimated the power of fanaticism. They assumed youth could not be strategy. They assumed belief could not be a weapon. They were wrong. The first confrontation came at the plains of Shah. Ismail's army was outnumbered, heavily, yet they carried an invisible armor, not steel, not numbers, but conviction. The Qizilbash chanted, red caps gleaming, eyes alight with the certainty of divine purpose. They moved as a living wave, surging forward with no hesitation. The battle unfolded like a storm. Horses clashed. Spears shattered. Swords rang against armor. And at the center, IsmailRode.com, composed, a boy king who seemed larger than life. His soldiers believed he could not die. His enemies believed he was more than human. Panic spread among the Aq Koyunlu lines as the young Shah's cavalry tore through their ranks. By nightfall, victory had been claimed against impossible odds. This was the first proof that the prophecy was real. The boy who had survived imprisonment, exile, and indoctrination had now proven himself on the battlefield. The Qizilbash, trained in faith, courage, and myth, became unstoppable. Every charge was suicidal. Every maneuver was guided by belief. They were not just an army, they were the embodiment of destiny itself. The march continued. Cities fell, not always through battle, but through the power of reputation. Towns surrendered at the sight of redcaps, fearing divine wrath more than any siege. Ismail's legend preceded him. Stories of miracles, of foresight, of impossible survival, spread faster than arrows could fly. The boy who had been told he was God was now being treated as such. When Tabriz finally came into view, the city was tense. Merchants shuttered shops. Nobles debated surrender or resistance. The streets were alive with rumors. Could a boy really claim the throne? Could faith be stronger than armies? Could destiny manifest in human flesh? Ismail entered the city, not with pomp, but with authority. His soldiers cleared the streets with disciplined zeal, not cruelty, and the population, though wary, could not ignore the force that had taken every challenge with miraculous speed. At the gates, the city leaders bowed, some in reverence, others in fear. The boy who had survived impossible odds now claimed the prize that older men had failed to secure. The coronation was not ceremonial in a traditional sense. There was no grand hall filled with banners of empire. There was only the boy, 14 years old, mounted on a horse, surrounded by his Qizilbash, the people watching in a mixture of awe, hope, and fear. The crown of Persia was placed upon his head, not because of birth alone, but because conquest, belief, and destiny had made it his. To outsiders, it may have seemed fragile, and it was. The population was hostile in many areas, still loyal to previous rulers, still suspicious of this boy king who claimed divinity. Some tribes remained The Aq Koyunlu were regrouping. Nobles whispered, plotting, waiting for a chance to strike. The throne, though claimed, was not secure. Every step Ismail took was a challenge, every decree a test of loyalty, and every victory a reminder that belief could only carry so far before the realities of governance intervened. But for now, the empire was his in essence, if not yet in totality. He had proven that faith, when wielded with skill, could topple armies, unite tribes, and create authority where none had existed. The boy king, trained in exile, hardened by myth and prophecy, was now a ruler in every sense that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Ismail worked to consolidate power. He rewarded loyal tribes with lands and positions, integrated defeated warriors into his army, and established the foundations of a state built not on inheritance alone, but on devotion and belief. The Qizilbash, once students of a mystical order, were now the enforcers, the protectors, and the symbol of the Safavid state. Yet danger lurked in every corner. The hostility of conquered populations could erupt at any time. The remnants of the Aq Koyunlu plotted their return. Other tribal leaders, jealous and ambitious, tested his authority, and the boy himself, still only 14, had to reconcile the roles of prophet, king, and soldier within his own mind. Every decision, every battle, every decree, carried the weight of expectations that could crush a man twice his age. This was the price of destiny. The streets of Tabriz became the stage for lessons in rulership. Every word he spoke was measured. Every command executed, not just for obedience, but for belief. The boy who had been told he was divine, now had to live it in front of a city, a region, and a world watching history unfold. His youth was both an advantage and a vulnerability. Innocence could inspire devotion, but it could also invite exploitation. Yet Ismail adapted. He learned to use his age as a symbol of divine favor. He cultivated the mythology of his invincibility. He reinforced the sacred aura around him, and he reminded his soldiers and the people that the throne was not just his by conquest, but by destiny. In the years that followed, the crown he had won at 14 would be tested repeatedly. Rebellions, conspiracies, and rival claimants challenged him. But this first victory, the march from Gilan, the battle against the Aq Koyunlu, the miraculous entry into Tabriz, and the coronation of a child king established a precedent. Belief could create kings. Faith could forge empires. And a boy, trained in survival, indoctrination, and myth, could claim a crown that others had fought decades to secure. The red-headed storm, the Qizilbash, had delivered their Shah to victory, and the world had witnessed the impossible. A child, crowned by blood and belief, standing at the threshold of empire. This was not merely a king. This was prophecy incarnate. And Persia, long fractured and chaotic, would never be the same again. The wind swept across the plains of Tabriz like a warning. The city, now the heart of the young Safavid Empire, had witnessed the impossible. A 14-year-old king, crowned not by inheritance alone, but by destiny, myth, and blood. But a crown is not enough. Thrones are fragile without unity. And Persia, fractured by decades of war and divided by faith, demanded more than a symbol. It demanded identity. Ismail, I understood this instinctively. His father, Haydar, had forged warriors. His early years in Gilan had forged belief. His conquest of Tabriz had forged fear and respect. Now, he would forge an empire, and he would do it in blood and faith. Persia, before the Safavids, was a mosaic of beliefs. Cities hummed with Sunni scholarship. Tribes recited the Quran in the traditions of their fathers. Mosques were aligned with the caliphates in Baghdad and beyond. Sunni clerics wielded influence. Regional rulers acted with semi-autonomy. Persia's spiritual landscape was fragmented, diverse, and volatile. To unify it, Ismail needed more than swords. He needed religion, and he needed it centralized, absolute, and loyal to the crown. It began with a declaration that would shock the Islamic world. Persia was now 12 or Shia, a Sunni practice, long dominant in cities and tribes alike, was now deemed heretical. The state, guided by Ismail, would impose this transformation across the land. At first, the announcement was met with disbelief. Scholars argued. Tribal leaders murmured rebellion. Merchants whispered in the bazaars, how could a teenager redefine faith for millions? How could the doctrines of centuries be overturned by a single boy, however divinely inspired? But Ismail understood that belief could be as much a weapon as a sword. Just as the Qizilbash had fought for faith on the battlefield, faith itself could conquer hearts, cities, and minds. It was not just ideology, it was strategy. To bind the tribes and provinces into a single, loyal state, he needed an identity that transcended bloodlines, loyalties, and past rivalries. Shi'ism became that identity. And so the revolution began. Sunrise brought sermons in newly consecrated mosques. Qizilbash patrols enforced the new orthodoxy. Sunni leaders were forced to convert, flee, or face execution. The transition was violent, swift, and often brutal. Cities that resisted were punished. Their leaders made examples of. Scholars from Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria were brought in to teach, to lecture, to cement the authority of Twelver Shi'ism. They became the backbone of the new religious elite. The psychological impact was immediate. Faith, weaponized, became a tool of control. Citizens who might have once defied authority now obeyed, out of fear of divine retribution. Communities once divided by tribal rivalries now shared a common belief, at least superficially, as the mark of loyalty to Shah Ismail I. The Qizilbash, already trained to fight for belief, became enforcers of doctrine. They patrolled cities, monitored mosques, and ensured compliance. Their reputation for fanaticism, honed in battle, now served domestic governance. The same courage and religious zeal that had made them unstoppable in war now imposed order at home. The forced conversion campaigns were merciless. In some villages, entire communities were relocated or exterminated. Mosques were realigned, shrines rebuilt, and Sunni institutions either destroyed or converted. Sunni clerics who resisted were executed or exiled. The message was clear. Loyalty to Ismail was inseparable from loyalty to Shi'ism. There could be no compromise. At the same time, Ismail imported scholars from the Shia heartlands Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain became sources of religious authority, bringing with them texts, rituals, and doctrines. These scholars trained new generations of clerics loyal to the Shah rather than distant caliphates. The state now had not only an army of red-capped warriors but also an army of theologians, capable of shaping hearts and minds for generations. The imposition of Twelver Shi'ism was more than political strategy. It was a social revolution. Marriages, inheritance, governance, and ritual practice were now standardized across Persia. Shiite jurisprudence became the law of the land. Religious festivals, the veneration of the 12 imams, and the mourning of Karbala became national identity markers. Even cities that had once resisted now displayed red flags and emblems of devotion to Ali and his descendants. Yet, the transformation came at a human cost. Families divided. Sunni and Shia communities clashed. Cities burned. Scholars were killed. The Qizilbash enforced compliance with fanaticism, making the revolution both swift and brutal. Blood became a medium of transformation. Belief became a weapon, and the line between devotion and terror was blurred. Still, for Ismail this was necessary. Persia, fractured for centuries, required unification, and unification could not be achieved with compromise or ambiguity. Faith, obedience, and myth would bind the people to the crown more effectively than armies or treaties ever could. The long-term consequences were profound. A new Iranian identity began to emerge, defined by Shi'ism, loyalty to the Safavid Shah, and cultural unity distinct from Sunni neighbors in the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia. Language, literature, architecture, and scholarship began to align with this identity, creating a cohesive vision of Persia under one faith and one ruler. The Safavid state was not just a political entity, it was a religious nation, and its citizens learned that personal belief was inseparable from civic duty. Even for Ismail himself, the revolution reinforced his personal mythology. The boy who had been told he was God now ruled not only armies but the souls of millions. Every sermon, every forced conversion, every new mosque built was a testament to his divine mandate. The crown he had won at 14 was now defended not only by swords but by faith itself. And yet, beneath the triumph, challenges simmered. The Qizilbash, zealous and independent, could be unruly. Tribal leaders still nursed old rivalries. Neighbors watched, plotting retaliation. The state was strong, but fragile, built on devotion as much as fear. The revolution was not complete. Resistance remained, both overt and hidden, and the young Shah knew that maintaining authority required constant vigilance. Still, the revolution transformed Persia irreversibly. By the end of Ismail's campaigns, a country that had once been a patchwork of tribes, faiths, and loyalties now had a unifying identity. Twelver Shi'ism was no longer just a belief system, it was the foundation of the state. Cities, villages, and tribes aligned themselves under a common banner of faith. Religious institutions were loyal to the Shah. The Qizilbash remained the enforcers of both army and religion. The Safavid Dynasty had achieved something extraordinary. A fusion of belief, blood, and governance that had never been seen in Persia before. Identity was no longer inherited or regional. It was forged in revolution, battle, and ideology. Ismail's vision of a Shia Iran would endure for centuries, outlasting rebellions, foreign invasions, and dynastic crises. The foundation laid by the young Shah in these early years became the blueprint for the nation's spiritual and political life. Shi'ism was no longer optional, peripheral, or foreign. It was the heart of Iran. In the streets of Tabriz and later Kazvin, the message was clear. Obedience to the Shah and adherence to Shia faith were inseparable. Festivals commemorated the martyrs of Karbala. Mosques taught loyalty to the 12 imams. Tribes and towns internalized this new identity. Sometimes willingly, sometimes through coercion, always under the shadow of the red caps of the Qizilbash. And through it all, Ismail watched, learned, and shaped the nation. The boy king had grown into a ruler. The crown won in childhood now presided over a country transformed by belief, forged in blood, and unified under a single identity. Persia, once fractured and chaotic, had become Shia Iran. The Shia revolution was complete, but it was only the beginning. The foundations laid in these years would define the culture, politics, and spiritual life of Iran for centuries. The consequences of forced faith, military fanaticism, and centralized religious authority would ripple across generations. Yet, for Ismail and his Qizilbash, this was destiny fulfilled. A nation united, an identity forged, and a crown secured by belief as much as by sword. Persia had been reborn, not through diplomacy, treaties, or trade, but through faith, force, and a child king's vision. The world watched, trembled, and took note. The red-headed storm had transformed into a spiritual revolution. And from the ashes of chaos, Shia Iran was born. The early morning sun struck the palace walls of Tabriz with a pale, cold light. It was the city of Ismail I, the boy who had become Shah, the conqueror of Persia. the architect of a Shia revolution, and the embodiment of a myth that had reshaped an entire nation. But within the walls of his court, shadows whispered a more complicated truth. He was a king, yes, a god to some, a tyrant to others, a poet, a mystic, a butcher. By day, he wore the crown with the authority of divine mandate. By night, he wandered the gardens, penning verses of longing, devotion, and ecstasy. His poetry was infused with Sufi imagery, the nightingale and the rose. The soul's longing for union, the intoxication of love, both divine and earthly. To his followers, these verses were proof of his enlightenment, of his connection to the divine. He was not merely a king, he was a spiritual phenomenon. Yet at the same time, the blood of conquest stained his hands. He commanded massacres with the same precision and certainty with which he arranged the syllables of a ghazal. Sunni clerics who resisted the Shia revolution, rebellious tribal leaders, dissenting nobles, none escaped the sword. Cities that defied him were leveled, families that opposed him were destroyed. He ruled through fear as much as faith, and his red-capped Kizilbash carried out his will with lethal devotion. The contradictions were startling. How could the same man who wrote of divine love also order mass executions? How could a mystic embody such terror? And yet, these contradictions were not accidents. They were the core of Ismail's genius. In the courts of Tabriz, he would sit for hours, reciting poetry that spoke of longing for the divine, of the union of the soul with God. Scholars, courtiers, and poets gathered to hear him. They recorded his verses, praised his mastery of metaphor and rhythm, and marveled at his mystical insight. His words were soft, intricate, and beautiful, a stark contrast to the harshness of his rule outside the palace walls. But the same man who recited ghazals could also walk through the streets with soldiers behind him, inspecting defenses, punishing insurgents, or commanding executions. Every act of violence was justified as a divine mandate, every massacre a necessary step toward unity, and every victory over rebellion framed as proof of his sacred destiny. Was he a cynic, manipulating faith and mysticism to maintain power? Or was he a true believer, living simultaneously in two worlds, the mystical and the political, the spiritual and the brutal? The answer was both, and that duality defined him. To his followers, Ismail was God incarnate. The boy king, who had been told he was divine, now demanded recognition as such. His red-capped soldiers treated his commands as sacred law. In battle, they charged without fear because they believed he was protected by the divine. In administration, obedience was enforced not just by orders, but by belief that defiance was heresy. Faith and power were inseparable. Yet for Ismail himself, belief may have been real, deeply felt, and intensely personal. His poetry reveals a man who wrestled with divine love, longing for spiritual unity, and a vision of transcendence. Mysticism, Sufi imagery, and theological reflection were not mere performance. They were a reflection of his inner life, of a mind that had been raised to see destiny, divinity, and duty as one. And still, politics required the butcher. The empire could not survive on poetry alone. Rivals, enemies, and rebels threatened the fragile unity he had built. Every city not fully loyal was a potential spark of insurrection. Every tribe with divided loyalty was a hazard. He enforced his rule ruthlessly. Faith was weaponized. Myth was codified. Obedience was demanded, sometimes with charm, sometimes with terror. One morning, in the royal gardens, Ismail recited a ghazal that spoke of the heart's longing for divine union. The verses were elegant, filled with metaphor and ecstasy. Yet later that same day, a delegation of Sunni clerics, defying his authority, was executed. Blood and roses, poetry and terror, all intertwined. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Some feared his genius, others feared his wrath. All were aware that Ismail's duality was a tool, a weapon, and a force of nature. The mystic and the butcher were inseparable. A king could not be both, yet Ismail embodied the contradiction perfectly. Observers from the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia were perplexed. How could a teenager command absolute devotion while simultaneously enforcing mass conversions? How could a mystic inspire love and terror in equal measure? And yet, they could not deny his success. Persia was unified under his rule. Shi'ism had been imposed. Tribal loyalty had been consolidated. The Safavid state existed where chaos had once reigned. Even within the Kizilbash, contradictions flourished. Soldiers who believed in his divinity sometimes struggled with the brutality required to maintain power. Loyalty was tested. Tribes, once fiercely independent, had to reconcile obedience to a divine king with centuries of personal and family honor. Many succumbed willingly, others with fear, but all became instruments of Ismail's dual vision. In private, Ismail wrestled with the question of his own divinity. Was he truly a chosen instrument of God, or had belief been instilled in him to ensure obedience? Did he genuinely see visions of the divine, or had his years of indoctrination and exile shaped him into believing he was more than human? The lines were blurred. Poetry, prophecy, and politics intertwined within him so tightly that separating personal conviction from performance became impossible. The Sufi imagery in his ghazals was not mere decoration. It was a reflection of his inner life, a symbolic language that communicated desire, longing, and transcendence. Yet, every poem also reinforced the perception of divine authority. Every metaphor of love and union doubled as a claim of sacred right. Art and politics were fused. Faith was both personal and public, mystical and brutal. Stories of his contradictions spread across Persia. Travelers recounted the spectacle of a king writing verses under candlelight, then walking into a city square to oversee executions. Merchants whispered of a monarch who wept over the beauty of a flower while planning the destruction of a rebellious village. Soldiers told tales of a leader who inspired them to impossible feats in battle while simultaneously commanding ruthless justice. Yet these contradictions were not weaknesses. They were the heart of his power. The people, the scholars, the soldiers, the tribes, all were caught between fear and awe, devotion and terror. No ruler before had so effectively blended mysticism, mythology, and murder into a single, unassailable authority. Even as Ismail aged, these contradictions persisted. Poetry remained central to his identity, as did the mysticism inherited from the Sufi orders of Ardabil. But the demands of empire, of governance, and of maintaining the loyalty of the Qizilbash required constant application of force. Compassion, mercy, and love were subordinated to necessity. Devotion and fear became indistinguishable. Was Ismail cynical? Perhaps. Was he a true believer? Perhaps. But in the end, it no longer mattered. The people saw God on horseback, a poet writing in candlelight, a butcher commanding fear. The crown he had won at 14 had transformed into authority, legitimacy, and legend. The contradictions were the essence of his genius. To rule, he needed to be all things at once, mystic and tyrant, poet and warrior, boy and god. The empire demanded duality, and Ismail embodied it flawlessly. In the end, the legacy of Ismail I was not simply conquest or religious revolution. It was the creation of a ruler who could embody paradox. The poet, the butcher, the god. The boy raised to believe in his divinity had become a king who made the impossible believable, who united fear and love, faith and terror, mythology and reality. Persia would remember him not just as a Shah, but as a symbol of contradiction itself. A ruler whose heart contained roses and blood, ecstasy and execution, devotion and cruelty. A king who proved that power is never simple, and that sometimes, to rule, one must be both the hand that blesses and the hand that strikes. The red-headed storm had delivered its god to the throne, but the true mastery of Ismail lay not in conquest alone, nor in religion alone, nor in poetry alone. It lay in the impossible balance of all three. And in that balance, a child king had become legend. The sun rose over the plains of Chowdhuran with an innocent brilliance, unaware that history was about to witness a clash of ideologies, faith, and technology, a confrontation that would shatter myths and reshape empires. Ismail I, the boy who had conquered Persia, the prophet king, the god incarnate to his people, led his red-headed storm across the dusty plains. His Qizilbash soldiers rode with familiar ferocity, their red caps a blaze of devotion under the rising sun. Every man believed in his divinity. Every man believed in victory, because they had always believed this was different. The Ottomans had come. Selim I, the Sultan of the rising Ottoman Empire, had sent a formidable army, disciplined, professional, and armed with the latest gunpowder weaponry. Cannons, muskets, and field artillery were at his command. Where the Qizilbash had relied on zeal, swords, and speed, the Ottomans wielded steel and fire with industrial precision. The battlefield, for the first time, would favor technology over faith. As dawn broke, Ismail surveyed the Ottoman lines. He saw the dense formation of soldiers, the glint of firearms, the columns of artillery ready to unleash devastation. His heart did not falter. He had faced impossible odds before Shamir and Tabriz, the Iku Koyunlu. He had turned prophecy into reality. His soldiers had never been defeated. Faith, he believed, would triumph once more. The battle began with the thunder of artillery. Cannons roared across the plains, shattering the earth, tossing men and horses alike. The Qizilbash, unaccustomed to the shrieking metal and smoke, faltered at first. But their devotion carried them forward. Swords in hand, they charged. Zeal met steel. Blood met lead. At first, it seemed the Qizilbash might prevail. Their speed, courage, and suicidal bravery tore through the initial Ottoman lines. Horses galloped, swords clanged, and cries of Allahu Akbar echoed across the plains. Faith, that unstoppable force that had carried them to victory after victory, surged forward. But the guns never stopped. The cannonballs tore through cavalry like thunder through the sky. Muskets cut down men before they could close the distance. Artillery ripped gaps through the charging waves of red caps. For the first time, belief alone could not protect them. Ismail watched, horrified and disbelieving. His soldiers, trained to see him as divine, were falling. The first lines of the red-headed storm collapsed under technology. They could not outrun or outfight. Panic began to spread. zeal was no match for gunpowder. Speed and courage could not overcome rifles and cannons. The battle turned into chaos. Qizilbash, who had believed themselves invincible, now faced the terrifying reality of mortality. Blood, once a medium of devotion, became a symbol of limitation. The myth of the God King began to crumble. Horses screamed, soldiers screamed, and the plain was filled with smoke, fire, and death. Ismail, once the embodiment of prophecy, now realized the fragility of myth. He rode among his men, urging them forward, praying aloud, invoking the names of the 12 imams, but faith could not shield them. Cannons tore through their ranks. The Ottoman discipline held. Lines remained steady while devotion faltered. Zeal was powerless against technology. By mid-afternoon the red-headed storm was shattered. Thousands of Qizilbash lay dead or dying, their banners trampled, their myth destroyed. The Ottomans pressed their advantage with relentless precision. Every charge was met with fire. Every maneuver blocked. Faith collided with gunpowder, and gunpowder won. The psychological impact on Ismail was immediate. For the first time, he was not the God King who commanded armies to victory. He was a boy watching the death of his soldiers, the collapse of his myth, the failure of his divinity. Panic, disbelief, and grief etched his face. His legendary aura, the invincibility that had defined him, vanished under the cannon fire and smoke of Chaldiran. The retreat was chaotic. Ismail rode through the shattered plains, trying to gather the remnants of his army. Soldiers, still loyal but terrified, struggled to regroup. Cities that had once trembled at the approach of the red-headed storm now whispered rumors of weakness. For the first time, fear was directed at him, not inspired by him. The Ottomans did not pursue. Safavid I recognized a victory that did not need further bloodshed. He had shattered the myth. He had destroyed the aura of invincibility. And that, more than anything, would have consequences far beyond the battlefield. In the aftermath, Ismail withdrew to Tabriz, his mind heavy with disbelief. His soldiers were demoralized. Tribal leaders questioned his judgment. Nobles whispered doubts. And the Boy King, who had been told an organization could defeat faith, zeal, and belief. The myth of the God King was broken. This psychological collapse haunted Ismail for years. The boy who had once charged across plains with unstoppable devotion now grappled with vulnerability. He learned, bitterly, that belief alone could not secure an empire. The invincibility that had carried him to Tabriz and consolidated his rule was an illusion, shattered by the modern weapons of a rising empire. Yet the lesson was more profound than mere military defeat. It was the first recognition that faith, while powerful, must be balanced with strategy, technology, and governance. Zeal could inspire devotion, but it could not replace artillery. Myth could unify, but it could not defend cities. And belief, no matter how absolute, had limits when confronted with the cold realities of organized warfare. The consequences for Persia were immediate. Northern territories remained unstable. Tribes questioned the safety of loyalty. Sunni neighbors, emboldened by Ottoman strength, plotted counterattacks. The Safavid state, still young, faced a reckoning. Its unifying ideology remained intact, but the limits of invincibility had been painfully exposed. Ismail himself retreated into introspection. He returned to poetry, to mysticism, and to the inner life that had always sustained him. Yet the boy who had claimed divinity now carried the weight of defeat. A constant reminder that even God Kings could fall. The red-headed storm, once unstoppable, had learned the ultimate lesson. Faith alone cannot win every battle. And yet, Chaldiran was more than a loss. It was a turning point. The Safavid Empire would survive, adapt, and endure. Ismail would integrate new strategies, consolidate loyal territories, and continue the transformation of Persia into a Shia state. But the aura of myth that had carried him for so long was irrevocably changed. Across the plains, the echoes of cannon fire faded, but the lessons of Chaldiran remained. The Boy King who had conquered Persia would now have to reconcile power, faith, and mortality. The God King had been humbled. Faith had met gunpowder, and gunpowder had won. History would remember Chaldiran not just as a battle, but as the end of an era. The invincible Shah was gone. The myth was broken, and the human ruler beneath the legend had emerged, marked by loss, wisdom, and the knowledge that even divinity could not conquer all. Ismail's journey, from child king to god, from poet to butcher, now entered its most dangerous and defining phase. The empire was no longer sustained solely by myth. It would require governance, strategy, and the painful awareness that faith, while powerful, had its limits. And on the plains of Chaldiran, the red-headed storm learned the most critical lesson of all. Gods can fall, and kings must survive. The winter wind bit across Tabriz like a blade, rattling shutters and sweeping dust through the empty streets. The city, once vibrant under the triumphs of the young Shah, now felt smaller, colder, more uncertain. The boy who had been crowned king at 14, the God King who had led his red-headed storm to conquest, was no longer invincible. Ismail I had returned from Chaldiran, a changed man. The plain had left a scar deeper than any wound. Cannon fire had shattered not only his army, but the illusion of his own divinity. For the first time, mortality had been unavoidable. Death had arrived on the battlefield, impartial and absolute, and it had spared no one, least of all his pride. At court, whispers spread faster than the wind. The Qizilbash, once fanatically loyal, now eyed each other and their Shah with a new wariness. Tribal rivalries, always simmering beneath the surface, resurfaced, emboldened by the knowledge that the boy who had claimed godhood could bleed, could falter, could fail. Ismail himself withdrew. Once a public figure of unassailable presence, he now secluded himself in the inner palaces, wandering gardens and corridors with a haunted gaze. His poetry continued, but the verses were darker, more introspective. Nights stretched into long hours of drink, the wine dulling the memories of cannons and blood. The ecstasy of divine union that had once inspired both poetry and terror was replaced with a gnawing emptiness, a realization that divinity, in human form, could be defeated. The Qizilbash, meanwhile, began to chafe under his absence. Loyalty, previously absolute, became conditional. The same warriors who had once stormed cities without fear now argued over strategy, rewards, and honor. Some challenged his authority openly. Others whispered in the shadows. Ismail's mystique, the very thing that had bound these disparate tribes into a unified army, had been fractured. The empire itself bore the weight of inherited trauma. Cities that had resisted Shi'ism during his rise now saw his vulnerability and tested the new order. Sunni neighbors in the northwest observed Persia's weakened posture, and borderlands, always tenuous, became restless, rebellions flared. Administrators feared the consequences of indecision. Every corner of the state reflected uncertainty. Authority, once absolute, had become fragile. In these years, Ismail's health and temperament began to unravel. Accounts speak of a king who drank heavily, indulged in excess, and became increasingly unpredictable. His brilliance, once apparent in both battle and poetry, was tempered by melancholy and frustration. Nights of writing verses alternated with days of enforced violence and tribal dispute. The God King was broken, and the empire trembled under the consequences of his human frailty. In private, Ismail reflected on the irony of his position. He had conquered Persia with belief, forged a religious identity, and imposed Twelver Shi'ism across a fractured land. Yet even these monumental achievements could not shield him from the vulnerabilities of the human body and the limits of perception. Faith, once his weapon, was no longer enough to control men or territory. The Qizilbash, whose devotion had been unwavering, now required governance, incentives, and reminders of loyalty. Myth, once a shield, was no longer a defense against internal discord. The burden of this realization was immense. A boy who had once believed in his own divinity now confronted the fragile reality of empire. Every decision carried disproportionate weight. Every failure threatened rebellion. Every delay could ignite chaos. Ismail had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited responsibility over an empire built on fanaticism, myth, and fear, now tested by defeat and mortality. As the years progressed, the cracks in the state widened. The Qizilbash began asserting autonomy, rival factions forming within the once unified military elite. Tribal conflicts, previously subordinated to divine authority, resurfaced. The mechanisms of governance struggled to contain unrest. Provinces that had been pacified during the early years of conquest now raised subtle defiance. Persia was unified in name, but its stability was tenuous. Ismail's personal decline mirrored the state's fragility. He became increasingly distant from the rituals that had once legitimized his rule, relying more on indulgence than leadership. Yet moments of brilliance and inspiration occasionally returned, particularly in poetry and spiritual reflection, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the myth. These moments, however, could not repair the structural weaknesses exposed at Chalduran. The Boy King's mortality had undermined the aura that had made the red-headed storm unstoppable. Even in death, Ismail's legacy carried contradictions. He died in 1524, aged only 37, leaving behind an empire unified under Shi'ism, but vulnerable to internal divisions and external threats. The crown he had won in childhood, maintained through blood and myth, passed to a successor whose authority was challenged by both the weight of expectations and the structural fragility inherited from Chalduan. Persia mourned the loss of the God King, but the mourning was tinged with uncertainty. Who could fill the void left by a ruler who had embodied divine authority, military genius, religious zeal, and poetic brilliance? The Qizilbash, loyal in theory but fractious in practice, would now assert their influence over succession and policy. The provinces, some still simmering with resistance, watched the court for signs of weakness. The empire's identity, forged in blood and faith, remained powerful yet precarious. Historians would later reflect on Ismail's reign as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. He had created Shah Ismail I, unified tribes under a central authority, and demonstrated the power of belief as a tool of statecraft. Yet he had also shown that myth alone cannot secure an empire. Leadership requires not only inspiration but also strategy, administration, and adaptation. The broken god left behind a fragile state, one where the mechanisms of governance had yet to catch up with the ambitions of conquest and ideology. The psychological imprint of Chalduran, and its aftermath endured for decades. Successive rulers inherited not only territory, but also the lessons of failure, the need to balance zeal with strategy, belief with pragmatism, and fear with governance. The myth of Ismail, simultaneously divine and flawed, became both a model and a warning. The empire's foundations were strong in faith but vulnerable in administration. The God King had died, but the consequences of his contradictions would shape Persia for generations. In the twilight of Ismail's life, the boy who had been crowned king of an empire at 14 reflected, perhaps with sorrow, perhaps with resignation, on the human cost of divinity. He had conquered with faith, imposed religion with zeal, inspired with poetry, and ruled with terror. Yet even gods can fail, even kings can be mortal, and even the most unified empire can bear the scars of human frailty. When Ismail died, the red-headed storm remained, the Qizilbash still formidable, the state still powerful. But the invincibility of the Boy King, the god who had conquered Persia, was gone. What remained was human rule, brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and fragile. The legacy of Ismail I, a mixture of divinity, poetry, tyranny, and innovation, would endure. But the empire he left behind, though unified and transformed, bore the permanent imprint of inherited trauma, a reminder that myth, zeal, and belief, no matter how absolute, must always contend with mortality, politics, and the limits of human authority. Persia had been forged, reborn, and unified under a god king, but now it had to survive without one. And in that survival lay the most dangerous challenge of all, preserving the empire built on blood, faith, and myth, while reconciling with the reality of human imperfection. The palace in Tabriz was silent, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any battlefield. 10-year-old Tahmasp sat on a throne too large for his small frame. The boy who had inherited the Safavid crown did so not with glory or conquest, but with a shivering awareness of danger. Around him, the red-headed storm, once united under his father, Ismail, had fractured. Tribal rivalries had resurfaced like wolves circling prey. The empire had survived children, but now survival was far more precarious than conquest had ever been. Tahmasp was no longer a boy king who rode to victory. He was a child among wolves. The Qizilbash, divided into powerful tribal factions, squabbled over influence, governorships, and spoils of war. The very men who had followed his father with unquestioning devotion now jockeyed for power in the absence of a strong hand. And Tahmasp, small and inexperienced, sat in the center of this storm, learning the first and most vital lesson of rulership: survival over glory. The palace itself became a cage. Every whisper could be treachery. Every gift could conceal poison. Courtiers smiled with the charm of loyalty while plotting rebellion. Tribal leaders claimed control over cities and provinces, testing the limits of the child's authority. The Qizilbash were no longer soldiers unified by faith. They were ambitious men who had learned that the throne could be manipulated, that the boy could be controlled. Tahmasp's daily life was a careful exercise in observation and silence. He watched, listened, and learned. Every argument between tribal leaders, every dispute over governorships, every subtle threat from a commander carried lessons that could not be taught in books. Fear became education, paranoia became a teacher, and patience, the most essential skill of all, became his shield. Outside the palace walls, the empire was unstable. Provinces that had once surrendered to the authority of Ismail now questioned loyalty. Sunni neighbors, still wary of the Shia revolution, watched for weakness. The Ottomans remained a looming threat, their artillery and disciplined armies, a constant reminder that Chalderan had not been a distant memory, but an enduring lesson. Tahmasp's survival required caution as much as courage. Every step had to be measured, every decision carefully weighed, and every word chosen with precision. The Boy King's education was brutal and unrelenting. Advisors drilled him in the realities of power, not theory, and often through fear. Every failure, every hesitation, was pointed out with sharp words or subtle threats. Tahmasp learned that in a palace filled with wolves, hesitation could be fatal. He learned to smile while inwardly calculating, to nod while silently resisting, to speak only when necessary. Silence became armor. Observation became strategy. And survival became the highest form of intelligence. Yet even in this crucible of fear and manipulation, Tahmasp absorbed the lessons of kingship. He learned the value of patience in governance, of subtlety in diplomacy, and of discipline in army organization. Unlike his father, whose youth had been fueled by divine myth and relentless zeal, Tahmasp would rule as a strategist. The boy understood, even before he had grown into the throne, that conquest was temporary, but survival built legacy. The Qizilbash civil wars raged across the empire. Tribal factions clashed in Tabriz and across the provinces, each asserting their dominance, each testing the boy's authority. Governors revolted. Governors were overthrown. Messages of rebellion traveled faster than couriers, and every village, every city, every fort became a battlefield of influence. Tahmasp's hand was weak. His mind was sharp. He learned to navigate these treacherous waters not by commanding armies into battle, but by maneuvering through politics with precision. In the private chambers of the palace, He would sit alone, contemplating maps of provinces, reports from governors, and letters from envoys. Every conflict became a lesson. Every betrayal became insight. He was learning to read the human heart, ambition, fear, loyalty, and greed, and to anticipate them all. The boy who had inherited a throne too large for his years became a master of patience and observation. Survival required more than courage. It required foresight, discipline, and cunning. Tomaspi also learned the harsh realities of secession. Puppet kingship, he discovered, could be deadly. Advisors and tribal leaders sought to control him, to dictate policy in his name, and in some cases, to replace him altogether. Yet the boy resisted openly and subtly. He cultivated loyalty among select factions, rewarded obedience with small authority, and punished dissent with calculated precision. Every victory was quiet, measured, and strategic. His small hands were shaping an empire without the thunder of conquest, without the spectacle of divine mandate, but with the enduring power of survival. The trauma of Ismail's death and the empire's vulnerability left an indelible mark on Tomaspi's psyche. He had inherited not only a crown but a legacy of instability, broken promises, and fractured authority. Childhood innocence was a luxury he could not afford. Every lesson was written in fear and blood, every smile calculated, every trust tested. The boy who would become one of Persia's most enduring rulers began to understand that survival, patience, and silence were far more potent than bravery alone. Even as a child, Tomas began reforming the Kizilbash army. He saw that loyalty based solely on myth and fear could not withstand external threats. He instituted stricter hierarchies, encouraged merit, and sought ways to temper tribal rivalry. The red-headed storm, once a chaotic and zealous force, was slowly being molded into a disciplined military machine. Tomas realized that the mistakes of his father, over-reliance on faith and mythology, could not guide the empire through the future. His political education was further reinforced by diplomacy. Envoys from the Ottoman Empire, the Uzbeks, and neighboring states tested his resolve. Young as he was, Tomas learned to negotiate, to delay, and sometimes to feign weakness to preserve the fragile state. He discovered that patience and diplomacy, like in politics, could be as effective as the sword, and that survival often required cunning rather than courage. Yet moments of humanity persisted. Tomaspi, despite his training in fear, developed empathy and insight. He learned to understand the motivations of his subjects, the desires of the tribes, and the psychology of his enemies. These lessons, absorbed in the shadows of palace intrigue, would later shape a ruler capable of consolidating power and ensuring the longevity of the Safavid state. The boy who had been thrust onto a throne at 10 learned silence as a weapon. He learned that words could wound as much as swords. A misplaced promise could ignite rebellion. A rash command could destroy loyalty. Observing, calculating, and waiting became his greatest strengths. He learned that survival, not glory, was the foundation of empire. Years of watching, learning, and enduring gradually transformed the child into a strategist. Tomas's small frame belied a mind that grasped the subtle interweaving of fear, loyalty, ambition, and governance. Every civil war, every factional dispute, every tribal conflict became a lesson in human behavior and political manipulation. The empire, though fragile, endured. Provinces stabilized under careful negotiation. Tribal loyalty, though still conditional, was gradually reinforced through both rewards and strategic punishment. The red-headed storm evolved into a disciplined military force, tempered by the lessons of children and internal conflict. And Tomas, the child king among wolves, survived, not through myth, divinity, or battlefield glory, but through patience, observation, and cunning. By the time he reached adulthood, the lessons learned in those perilous years of puppet kingship had hardened him into one of Persia's most capable rulers. He had survived where others might have fallen. He had endured where myth alone had failed. And he had learned that an empire could not be held together by zeal or fear alone, only by understanding, strategy, and the patient, sometimes ruthless exercise of power. The story of Tomaspi begins here, amidst intrigue, danger, and survival. The child who had inherited a crown too heavy for his years became the man who would preserve the Safavid state, unify its people, and protect its fragile identity. The god king was dead. The empire was human. And the child among wolves would prove that survival, far more than glory, defined the destiny of Persia. In the silence of the palace, young Tomaspi's eyes reflected the weight of responsibility. Every whisper, every shadow, every subtle threat was noted, stored, and transformed into lessons for the future. He had learned what Ismail had never needed to teach. Survival is the ultimate form of intelligence, and patience is the weapon of kings. The red-headed storm would follow him, the provinces would obey him, and the empire, though still fragile, would endure. The boy king, among wolves, had begun to understand the art of ruling, not through divine myth, not through overwhelming zeal, but through observation, patience, and unflinching resolve. And thus began the long, careful, and cunning reign of Tomas I, the boy who learned to survive among predators. The plains along the western frontier of Persia were quiet, deceptively quiet. The wind whispered through the reeds, and the dust stirred across the roads like a warning. In the distance, the Ottoman banners gleamed in the sun. Soldiers marched with measured precision. Cannons waited, and Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan, whose empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, approached with all the authority of a rising superpower. But the man who stood on the walls of Tabriz, watching the Ottomans advance, was not a boy king this time. He was Tumasp I, the ruler who had learned patience, silence, and survival as a child. His red-headed storm had been tempered by decades of internal civil war, by the memory of Chaldiran, by the bitter lessons of myth and mortality. He understood that a frontal clash with the Ottoman army, disciplined and armed with artillery, would be disastrous. Victory would not come through heroics, it would come through strategy. The Ottomans moved, like a tide across the plains, confident in their superior numbers, their cannons, and the reputation of their sultan. They expected the usual Safavid response, a charge, a desperate assault, a clash of zeal against steel. But Tomasp had learned better. He ordered the scorched earth. Fields were burned, wells were poisoned or emptied, grain stores were hidden or destroyed, villages were evacuated. Cities, once vibrant, were emptied of resources, leaving only barren streets and silent walls. The Ottomans marched into a land stripped of sustenance, their supply lines stretched thin, their morale tested before battle even began. Tomasp did not engage. He retreated strategically, drawing the Ottomans deeper into territory that offered no victory. His army shadowed theirs, harassing supply lines, ambushing small detachments, and then vanishing into the mountains or deserts. Each skirmish was calculated, each withdrawal deliberate. The young Shah, once a child among wolves, now manipulated a vast chessboard of strategy with a mastery that belied his years. The Ottomans, accustomed to decisiveness and the glory of open battle, found themselves frustrated. Soldiers murmured, officers argued, and Suleiman himself realized that the Safavids were not retreating out of fear, they were refusing to fight. Persia itself had become a weapon. Logistics, supply, and exhaustion were now the enemies of the invader. The more Suleiman advanced, the weaker his position became. Tomasp's strategy was simple but brilliant. Deny the enemy victory without risking the red-headed storm in direct confrontation. Faith and zeal could inspire soldiers to charge into cannon fire, but Tomasp knew that survival, preparation, and patience could achieve more. Each retreat preserved his army, minimized casualties, and forced the Ottomans to confront the limits of supply and endurance. Weeks passed. The Ottomans moved cautiously, their advance slowed by famine, heat, and logistical chaos. Horses starved, soldiers grew weary, artillery required fodder and manpower. Each day of movement without engagement gnawed at morale. And through it all, Tomasp's forces remained intact, observing, calculating, waiting. The scorched earth was more than destruction. It was communication. It told Suleiman and his commanders that Persia would not be won by the sword alone. It demanded respect for the land, for the people, and for the strategy of a ruler who had survived Chaldiran and learned the limits of heroics. The boy who had inherited a fractured empire had grown into a king who understood the subtlety of power. Finally, after months of attrition, negotiations began. Both empires had endured the strain of preparation, movement, and tension. Tomasp had preserved his army, his territories, and his authority. Suleiman had reached the limits of logistical feasibility. Neither side was defeated in battle, but the Safavid strategy had achieved the ultimate goal, victory without a fight. The Treaty of Amasya was signed. It recognized boundaries, established spheres of influence, and perhaps most importantly, guaranteed a long peace between the Safavids and the Ottomans, the first in decades. Persia had survived, unbroken and united. The red-headed storm remained intact. The myth of invincibility no longer depended on the God King, but on strategic mastery. Tomasp's approach marked a shift in Safavid leadership. Survival, patience, and strategy had replaced heroics and myth. Conquest was no longer the measure of greatness. Administration, foresight, and control had become the defining tools of empire. The empire, fragile in its infancy, now possessed a ruler capable of preserving it against forces far larger and more technologically advanced. The psychological impact on Persia was profound. The people saw that victory was not always measured in battles won, but in the preservation of life, territory, and sovereignty. The Kizilbash, once reckless and zealous, were disciplined by necessity. Tribes that had challenged authority learned the value of obedience in the service of survival. The empire itself had internalized the lesson. Strategy could overcome brute force, and patience could triumph where myth had failed. Tomasp's retreat and resist strategy was more than military, it was political. By avoiding direct confrontation, he prevented internal demobilization. No catastrophic battle could fracture loyalty among his tribes. The fragile alliances that held the Safavid state together remained intact. Every withdrawal was a calculated reinforcement of the empire's cohesion, ensuring that the state could endure challenges far beyond the battlefield. Even in diplomacy, Tomasp's patience paid dividends. Envoys, treaties, and negotiations became tools of statecraft as powerful as any army. He understood that wars were won not only by men and cannons, but also by perception, by the control of narrative, and by the cultivation of strategic patience. Survival, as he had learned as a child among wolves, was the ultimate form of victory. The Treaty of Amasya ushered in an era of stability. Trade flourished along the Safavid border. Cultural exchange increased, and Persia, once isolated by conflict, began to prosper. The empire, tested by external threat and internal fragility, emerged stronger in governance and more resilient in identity. Shi'ism remained the unifying ideology, the red-headed storm disciplined and loyal, and the Kizilbash tempered by strategic restraint. Tahmasp himself matured into a ruler who balanced prudence with authority. He had learned that the invincibility of his father had been a myth shattered at Chapterin, but that survival, intelligence, and calculated restraint could secure the state indefinitely. The Boy King among wolves had become a master of strategy, a king whose victories were measured not by glory but by endurance. History would remember this phase of the Safavid Empire as the triumph of strategy over heroics. Chalderan had shown the limits of zeal. The Ottoman invasions under Suleiman demonstrated the power of patience. Persia had survived where many predicted disaster. The empire had won without fighting, not through myth, not through divine favor, but through careful calculation, foresight, and the hard-earned lessons of experience. In the halls of Tabriz and Kazvin, whispers of victory without battle spread. Scholars recorded Tahmasp's strategies. Tribal leaders learned that obedience rewarded longevity, not spectacle. The red-headed storm became a disciplined instrument of the state, capable of projecting power and enforcing policy without the need for reckless heroics. The Safavid state had matured, evolving from one built on myth, zeal, and the charisma of a god-king to one sustained by strategy, foresight, and governance. The boy who had survived among wolves had now become the man who preserved an empire. Victory had been redefined. Glory on the battlefield was no longer the measure of strength. Endurance, patience, and the clever use of strategy had triumphed. The Safavid Empire, though still young, had acquired the stability and respect of a major power in the region. Tahmasp's reign, solidified through the Treaty of Amasya, marked the beginning of the first long-term peace with the Ottomans, a peace that would last decades. It demonstrated the power of restraint over recklessness, of intelligence over passion, and of survival over heroics. The empire, forged in the fires of myth, faith, and blood, had now been tempered by strategy and patience. And so, the Safavid Empire endured. The red-headed storm remained, disciplined and loyal. The Kizilbash, once unpredictable, were tempered by necessity. Provinces, once fractious, recognized the wisdom of obedience. Persia had learned that the absence of battle could yield a victory more enduring than any conquest, and that a ruler who knew when to fight and when to wait could shape the destiny of a nation without shedding another drop of blood. Tahmasp I, the boy king who had survived Chalderan and learned patience among wolves, had proven that empires were won not only through force but through wisdom. Strategy had triumphed. Myth had been replaced by prudence, and the Safavid state had achieved stability, identity, and respect in a volatile world, without a single decisive battle. The wind howled through the palace corridors of Kazvin, rattling shutters and scattering dust across the stone floors. Inside, the halls were quiet, deceptively quiet, like the calm before a storm. Tahmasp I walked slowly, his eyes cold, observing faces that once smiled with loyalty but now concealed ambition, fear, and resentment. The boy who had survived among wolves had grown into a man who understood that survival required more than patience or strategy. It required courage to destroy the very foundations of his power. The Kizilbash, the red-headed storm, had once been the lifeblood of the Safavid rise. They had carried his father, Ismail, to victory, shaped Persia with zeal, and cemented Shi'ism across the land. But zeal alone could not sustain an empire. By now, Tahmasp understood that the fanaticism that had forged the empire could also destroy it. Loyalty built on blood and myth was unpredictable, dangerous, and undisciplined. The very warriors who had once been invincible in battle now challenged authority, divided themselves into factions, and treated the young Shah as a figurehead rather than a king. Tahmasp's strategy was clear. The state must come before the tribe. The empire could not survive if the Kizilbash ruled through factionalism. Myth had built Persia. Administration would keep it together. And to enforce that truth, he had to act decisively, ruthlessly. Executions began quietly, away from the courtly eyes of the people. Tribal leaders who had overstepped their authority, who had conspired to manipulate the throne, were summoned under the guise of counsel and negotiation. Guards, loyal to the Shah rather than any faction, led them to hidden chambers. The first ones were beheaded swiftly, others were strangled quietly, their blood leaving no trace but the knowledge of fear. Whispers spread like wildfire among the remaining Kizilbash. Loyalty was no longer assumed. Obedience was enforced by terror. Tahmasp watched carefully, observing every reaction. The survivors of the purge realized that myth could no longer protect them. The Shah was no longer a figurehead or puppet. He was a ruler willing to wield the authority of life and death to secure the state. Tribal chiefs, once masters of kings, now understood that the era of unchecked power had ended. The red-headed storm was still formidable, but its independence had been curtailed. Fanaticism, for all its glory, had limits. The state demanded discipline. David and Drul became Tahmasp's tool. He exploited tribal rivalries, granting authorities selectively to loyal leaders while weakening the more ambitious factions. Rewards were carefully calculated, punishments swift and unambiguous. No Qizilbash could dominate without the Shah's explicit permission. Gradually, the chaotic army that had charged into battles with reckless zeal transformed into a disciplined instrument of the state. Authority no longer flowed from myth or prophecy, but from the central power of the monarch. The palace itself became a theater of political control. Courtiers learned to tread carefully. Even minor gestures of disloyalty could trigger suspicion and punishment. Letters and messages were intercepted, plans carefully monitored. Tahmasp had transformed governance into a strategic game of observation, calculation, and enforcement. The empire's bureaucracy expanded, slowly taking over roles that had previously been dominated by tribal influence. Provinces were reorganized, governors appointed with precision, and the central treasury strengthened. The Safavid state, once precariously balanced on fanaticism and myth, now had the skeleton of institutional authority, yet the human cost was immense. Executions, forced relocations, and punitive measures left scars among the Qizilbash and across the provinces. Families mourned leaders who had once wielded power. Tribes resented the centralization of authority. Fear, while effective, bred subtle discontent that required constant management. Tahmasp understood that to govern through bureaucracy and strategy, he could never rely solely on loyalty. Obedience had to be enforced through law, calculation, and, when necessary, terror. Tahmasp's methodical dismantling of Qizilbash power reflected the deeper principle that fanaticism could not govern. Inspiration, belief, and zeal were powerful forces in battle, but they were unstable foundations for administration. Wars won through sacrifice and devotion could be undone by internal divisions. The survival of the empire required a ruler willing to kill the founders, to prioritize the state over personal loyalty, and to impose order where myth and faith had once sufficed. In the council chambers, Tahmasp reviewed reports from the provinces. Governors now answered directly to him. Tribal chiefs obeyed instructions or faced consequences, and the empire began to function as a cohesive unit rather than a coalition of competing factions. Slowly, the chaos that had threatened Persia after Chaldiran gave way to structure, discipline, and a sense of enduring authority. The red-headed storm, once a symbol of unstoppable zeal, now reflected the changing nature of power. Soldiers trained in loyalty to the Shah rather than individual tribal leaders. Units were reorganized, hierarchical chains established, and obedience became systematic. Myth could inspire courage, but it was discipline that preserved an empire. Tahmasp's reforms ensured that the state could survive even without the charismatic god-king his father had been. Tahmasp himself became a master of psychological warfare within his own court. Loyalty was tested, alliances shifted, and every decision sent a signal to potential challengers. He learned to leverage fear without alienating key factions entirely, balancing punishment with reward, terror with incentive. Through these actions, he transformed the Qizilbash from unpredictable fanatics into controlled instruments of state power. Even within the palace, the balance of power had shifted. Regents and advisors, once the true power behind the throne, during Tahmasp's childhood, were either executed or carefully monitored. Puppet kingship, which had once endangered him, was now replaced by direct, unambiguous authority. The boy who had survived among wolves was now a king capable of controlling those who had once controlled him. The consequences of this consolidation were profound. Persia's provinces stabilized, borders could be defended more efficiently, taxation became more predictable, and governance more coherent. The Safavid state had evolved from an empire built on the charisma and myth of its founder into a functioning bureaucratic machine, capable of enduring challenges both internal and external. Yet the cost of enforcing this authority was visible in every corner of the court. Fear lingered in the eyes of the Qizilbash. Tribal disputes simmered beneath the surface, restrained by the knowledge that any misstep could be fatal. The Shah had killed not only potential challengers but also the old ways of leadership based on tribal autonomy. Fanaticism, the force that had once built Persia, had been tamed and in some ways, destroyed. Tahmasp's reign marked the birth of the bureaucratic Safavid state. Myth and zeal remained tools for inspiring devotion and maintaining ideology. But the mechanisms of government, taxation, military organization, and diplomacy now rested firmly in the hands of the Shah. The empire could no longer rely solely on the fervor of the red-headed storm. It relied on structure, strategy, and central authority. Across the empire, the legacy of this period was felt for generations. Tribal elites learned that personal ambition must be tempered by loyalty to the state. Governors and military commanders understood that authority flowed from the Shah, not from bloodlines or battlefield heroics. The bureaucracy, strengthened and centralized, became the backbone of the Safavid state. Myth could inspire soldiers, but it was discipline, administration, and enforcement that preserved the empire. Tahmasp's decision to kill the founders, the tribal elites who had once been untouchable, was not an act of cruelty alone. It was a calculated strategy, a recognition that Persia could not endure on zeal alone. Myth, faith, and fanaticism had forged the empire, but they could not sustain it. Authority, structure, and ruthless enforcement of loyalty were essential for survival. By the end of this phase of his reign, Tahmasp transformed the Safavid state. The empire remained loyal in name and ideology, but it was now a system governed by law, strategy, and centralized authority rather than unbridled passion. The red-headed storm, disciplined and wary, served not as autonomous rulers but as instruments of the Shah's will. The state had survived, matured, and endured. Tahmasp learned the ultimate lesson. To preserve an empire, a ruler must sometimes kill the founders. Zeal cannot govern. Faith cannot administer. Myth alone cannot protect borders or enforce taxes. Only the cold, calculated exercise of authority can ensure the survival of a state born of blood and devotion. And so, Persia endured. The Qizilbash were controlled, the bureaucracy strengthened, and the Safavid Empire, once fragile and chaotic, now had the tools to survive generations. Tahmasp's actions may have been ruthless, but they were necessary. Fanaticism had built the empire. Strategy, enforcement, and authority would preserve it. The child who had survived among wolves had become the master of an empire, willing to kill the founders to ensure that Persia would not only live but endure. Myth had been tamed, fanaticism disciplined, and the Safavid state, tempered by fire and strategy, was now ready to face the challenges of the world beyond its borders. Tahmasp, the boy who learned patience, silence, and survival, had become the ruler who understood that the true test of power is not in conquest or zeal, but in the creation of a state strong enough to endure long after the gods, myths, and founders have passed. The sun rose over the city of Qazvin, casting long shadows across the newly built streets and stone walls. In the quiet of the morning, artisans opened their workshops, the faint clatter of brushes on paper and chisels against stone echoing through the corridors. Inside the palace, Tahmasp I walked slowly. Observing, the boy who had survived among wolves now ruled an empire where power was measured not only by armies but by the ink on a page, the stroke of a brush, and the arrangement of stones in a palace. This was the era of the Shahnameh of Tahmasp, a manuscript unlike any other. Pages larger than life were spread across tables, illuminated with colors so vivid they seemed to glow in candlelight. Miniature paintings depicted battles, hunts, and kings of Persia's storied past. Warriors clashed with swords, horses reared, and kings sat on golden thrones, their faces calm, composed, and commanding. Every stroke, every image, was deliberate, a reminder of the continuity of Persian kingship. Tahmasp understood the power of this art. It was not decoration, it was propaganda, subtle and profound. By commissioning these works, he linked the Safavid Dynasty to the ancient kings of Iran, those legendary figures of the Shahnameh in pre-Islamic history. Persia had been forged in blood and zeal, but art would cement its legitimacy. Each miniature, each page, told the story of divine right, heroic leadership, and enduring authority. In the palace, artists worked tirelessly under Tahmasp's watchful eye. He studied each illustration, critiqued each color, questioned every composition. The artisans trembled before his scrutiny, knowing that their work was not only a reflection of skill, but a reflection of the state itself. The Shah understood that culture could unify a fractured empire where myth and fanaticism alone could no longer bind the people. Beyond the illuminated pages, the architecture of the empire spoke the same language. Mosques rose with intricate tilework, palaces displayed symmetrical gardens, and streets were laid with precision and order. Every structure symbolized more than beauty. It symbolized authority, stability, and the centralization of power. Persia had survived Chaldean, internal strife, and Ottoman threats, and now it would project its legitimacy through culture, order, and visible markers of state power. Tahmasp's approach was subtle. Art was propaganda, but it was gentle. The people were not coerced to admire it, they were inspired by it. Miniatures taught history. Mosques embodied unity. Palaces displayed strength. Every element of culture became a tool of governance, binding the people to the Shah not through fear alone but through shared identity and pride. Persia itself became a canvas. Each city, each monument, each manuscript, a brushstroke reinforcing the narrative of Safavid authority. At the heart of this cultural revolution was the Shahnameh of Tahmasp. Scenes of kings and heroes were carefully curated. Battles depicted valor and strategy. Hunts reflected dominion over nature, and courts exemplified wisdom and justice. Through these images, Tahmasp linked himself to Cyrus, Darius, and Khosrow, rulers whose legacy transcended time. Persia had survived centuries of invasion and chaos, and the Safavids now positioned themselves as heirs to this immortal lineage. Yet culture was more than symbolism. It was administration. Tomaspi's careful patronage reflected his understanding that an empire's survival depended on more than loyalty or zeal. Scholars, clerics, and artists were given roles that reinforced the state's ideology. Libraries flourished, and courts of learning were established alongside courts of governance. Art and scholarship became intertwined with the mechanisms of rule. Knowledge was power, and culture was the glue that bound bureaucracy to monarchy. Provinces to the capital, and people to king. The palace workshops were alive with tension and purpose. Calligraphers traced verses of poetry and scripture with perfect precision. Illuminators added gold leaf, transforming text into sacred art. Miniature painters depicted scenes of courtly life, battles, and ancient Persian legends, each image reflecting both historical continuity and contemporary authority. Tomaspi walked among them, observing, instructing, and ensuring that the final product communicated both beauty and legitimacy. Every commission sent a message beyond the palace walls. To the Kizilbash, the manuscripts demonstrated the Shah's intelligence, taste, and authority. To neighboring powers, the art proclaimed Persia's sophistication and the continuity of its rule. To the people, it provided a sense of identity, linking the present to a heroic past. Through these subtle, non-violent tools, Tomasp reinforced obedience, pride, and unity, a demonstration that survival and statecraft were not only maintained through armies but also through culture. Persian kingship symbolism extended beyond paintings and palaces. Ceremonies, rituals, and court protocol were carefully choreographed. Every gesture, every robe, every throne placement communicated hierarchy, legitimacy, and divine favor. Tomaspi, who had survived childhood as a pawn in Kizilbash factionalism, understood the importance of controlling perception. Myth, once a battlefield tool for his father, now became a calculated instrument of governance. And yet, beneath this cultural refinement, Tomasp remained a ruler forged by experience. He had learned the lessons of survival and statecraft, patience, observation, and decisiveness. Art and culture were powerful, but they functioned within the framework of a disciplined state. Administrators enforced law, governors reported to the central authority, and the red-headed storm, now disciplined and loyal, enforced order when persuasion failed. Culture was the soft power. Bureaucracy, law, and disciplined military force were the hard power. Together, they preserved the empire. Tomasp's initiatives transformed Persia from a state forged by zeal into an empire strengthened by administration and legitimacy. Culture became inseparable from governance. Miniatures, manuscripts, and architecture communicated authority, unity, and identity. Courts and palaces became symbols of order, reinforcing the Shah's presence even in the provinces. Religion and art intertwined, promoting Shi'ism as the ideological backbone of the state while demonstrating continuity with Persia's storied past. Even the selection of artists and scholars was strategic. Individuals loyal to the Shah were elevated, creating networks of influence that tied culture directly to governance. Talent became both reward and tool, incentives for loyalty, instruments of legitimacy, and symbols of state sophistication. Every brushstroke, every verse, every architectural line contributed to the broader project of empire building. Tomasp's reign revealed a new truth about power. Glory and heroics could inspire, but order, culture, and legitimacy preserved. Persia's survival was no longer reliant on battlefield zeal or charismatic leaders alone. Art became propaganda, administration became the backbone, and culture became a binding force, uniting tribes, cities, and provinces under the subtle authority of the Shah. As the years progressed, the Shahnameh of Tomasp circulated among the elite. Scholars studied its pages, courtiers admired its artistry. Foreign envoys marveled at the skill and sophistication of the Safavid court. Persia, once threatened by internal divisions and external enemies, now wielded culture as a tool of both diplomacy and governance. Authority no longer depended solely on myth or fanaticism. It depended on the visible, tangible symbols of state power that culture provided. Tomasp's brilliance lay in balance. Military reforms preserved security. Bureaucracy ensured order. And art, architecture, and scholarship created legitimacy. Culture became the invisible glue that held the empire together, binding subjects to the state, reinforcing authority, and cultivating a shared identity rooted in both Persian history and Shia ideology. The Shahnameh, the mosques, the palaces, and the illuminated courts were not mere decoration. They were instruments of policy, tangible expressions of governance, and symbols of the enduring power of the Safavid state. Through them, Tomasp communicated a simple yet profound message. The Safavid Empire was no longer fragile, chaotic, or dependent solely on zeal. It was legitimate, ordered, and enduring. By the end of this era, Persia had been transformed. The red-headed storm, disciplined and loyal, enforced authority. The bureaucracy ensured order. Culture and art reinforced identity and legitimacy. Provinces obeyed, citizens respected, and foreign powers acknowledged Persia's stability and sophistication. The empire that had been forged in blood, zeal, and survival now flourished in culture, order, and administration. Tahmasp I, the child who had survived among wolves, had matured into a ruler who understood the subtle art of governance. He had learned that survival depended not only on armies but on legitimacy. That authority could be reinforced, not just through fear but through culture. That art, scholarship, and ceremony could become as powerful as any sword in preserving an empire. Persia endured, not only because of the red-headed storm, not only because of Shi'ism, not only because of history, but because the Shah had linked power, faith, and culture into a system capable of sustaining authority for generations. Order, legitimacy, and the quiet strength of administration had become the pillars of Safavid power. And as Tahmasp gazed over the illuminated manuscripts and the grand palaces, he knew the truth he had learned from childhood. Glory and myth could inspire, zeal could conquer, but culture, order, and legitimacy, these were what preserved an empire. The Shahnameh of Tahmasp was not just a book. It was a blueprint for statecraft. Art had become power, and Persia had become immortal. The palace of Kazvin was no longer a place of quiet order. Shadows moved where sunlight had once spilled, and whispers carried through corridors like ghosts of past reigns. The Safavid Empire, forged by blood, zeal, and the patient strategy of Tahmasp I, now trembled under the weight of succession. Stability, which had been painstakingly built over decades, threatened to crumble in a matter of years. Tahmasp ruled with patience, cunning, and a steady hand. His reforms had disciplined the Qizilbash, strengthened the bureaucracy, and bound the empire through culture, administration, and order. But even the most meticulous structures can be vulnerable when the heart of power changes hands. The throne, once occupied by a ruler who had survived childhood as a pawn among wolves, was now inherited by those ill-prepared to wield authority. And with each transition, the empire teetered dangerously on the edge. Ismail II ascended to the throne with the weight of expectation and the shadow of paranoia. The boy who had once survived children and palace intrigue now faced the consequences of succession unchecked by experience. Ismail's mind, consumed by suspicion, saw enemies in every corner. Advisors, generals, even family members were potential threats. No counsel was trusted. Every whisper, every glance, became proof of conspiracy. Fear, which had been a tool for Tahmasp, became the master of Ismail II. Decisions were erratic. Orders were contradictory. Tribes, once carefully balanced through dividendal strategies, began to challenge the throne. The red-headed storm fractured under the weight of suspicion. Loyalty, carefully nurtured over decades, dissolved into self-preservation and intrigue. In the provinces, governors acted with increasing independence. The careful hierarchy Tahmasp had built began to falter. Revenue faltered, law enforcement weakened, and the distant Ottoman and Uzbek threats grew bolder. Where Tahmasp had managed retreat and diplomacy with subtlety, Ismail II relied on brute force and paranoia. Troops were moved unnecessarily. Executions spread fear but failed to enforce obedience. The fragile balance of the empire was collapsing. After only a brief reign, Ismail II's paranoia proved fatal, both to himself and to the stability of Persia. His sudden death plunged the empire into chaos. The throne passed to Muhammad Qutbanda, a ruler whose weakness contrasted sharply with his predecessor's decisive authority. Qutbanda, physically infirm and mentally indecisive, could neither control the fractious Qizilbash nor manage the bureaucracy that had been carefully constructed over decades. The return of chaos was swift and merciless. Tribes rebelled openly, provincial governors ignored central authority, and the once disciplined red-headed storm fractured into factions. What had been a cohesive military and administrative structure under Tahmasp now became a battlefield of competing ambitions. Every faction sought advantage, every rebellion threatened to spread, and the very foundations of the empire trembled. External threats compounded internal weakness. The Ottomans, ever watchful of Persia's instability, seized the opportunity to advance. Border raids escalated into serious incursions, testing a leadership incapable of coherent response. To the north, the Uzbeks pressed in, raiding, pillaging, and exploiting every sign of weakness. Persia, once resilient under Tahmasp, now faced a perfect storm. Internal fragmentation and external aggression simultaneously. Inside the palace, fear and indecision were palpable. Advisors argued endlessly, often contradicting each other, while Qutbanda vacillated between inaction and impulsive commands. The memory of Tahmasp's steady rule became a ghost, haunting every corner. The careful systems of administration could not compensate for a monarch who lacked decisiveness. Departments became chaotic. Troops disobeyed orders. Provinces withheld tribute. The state teetered on the brink of collapse. Even religion, which had once unified Persia under Shi'ism, could no longer guarantee loyalty. The Qizilbash factions, previously disciplined through fear and reward, acted independently. They no longer feared divine authority alone, and with a weak Shah, they answered only to opportunity and ambition. The very zeal that had built the empire now fueled its internal destruction. Fanaticism, uncontrolled, became a source of vulnerability rather than power. The empire, which Tahmasp had nurtured with patience, order, and culture, was undone by the curse of succession. Every weak ruler exposed the fragility of even the most enduring systems. Every factional rebellion reminded the court that authority, once seated, could be lost in months. Persia, which had once survived external invasions through strategy, now faced collapse because its internal cohesion had been undermined by indecision and paranoia. Reports of Ottoman and Uzbek incursions reached Kazvin daily. Villages were burned, trade routes disrupted, and local governors ignored calls for reinforcements. The red-headed storm, divided and leaderless, could not respond effectively. Where Tahmasp had used patience, logistics, and calculated strategy to maintain order, Kotabanda's weakness allowed chaos to reign. Supply lines failed. Tribes fought each other instead of the enemy. The empire teetered on the edge of disintegration. Diplomatic channels, once skillfully employed to maintain peace and stability, faltered under weak leadership. Envoys found indecisive monarchs unable to negotiate effectively. Tribes along the borders began shifting allegiance, seeking protection from whoever promised stronger authority. The Safavid Empire, meticulously built over decades of reform and consolidation, now risked unraveling in the span of a single decade. The psychological impact on the people was profound. Fear replaced respect. Uncertainty replaced loyalty. Where Tahmasp had inspired obedience through a combination of order, culture, and fear, Ismail II and Kotabanda could inspire neither confidence nor devotion. Tribes acted independently. Provinces rebelled quietly, and external enemies pressed ever closer. The empire was exposed, vulnerable, and near collapse. Even the Shah's court, once the center of administration, became a place of intrigue and betrayal. Advisors competed for influence, often working at cross purposes. Orders were ignored, misinterpreted, or delayed. Every decision required negotiation among factions rather than authority from the throne. Where myth had once provided legitimacy, now weakness eroded it. Where zeal had once inspired soldiers, now indecision demoralized them. Persia's survival depended on structures built decades before, and even those were under strain. Yet in the chaos, there were moments of strategy, though rare and fleeting. Some governors attempted to enforce local order. Some Qizilbash factions remained loyal, wary of external threats. But these isolated efforts were insufficient to hold the empire together. The curse of succession, weak, paranoid, indecisive rulers, had exposed the vulnerability of even the strongest state. The empire survived, but it was hanging by threads. By the end of Kotabanda's reign, the Safavid Empire had experienced the full consequences of unstable succession. Internal disorder, external threats, and divided loyalties demonstrated a fundamental truth. Even the strongest foundations of state, meticulously built through discipline, culture, and administration, could be undermined by weak rulers. Stability could collapse faster than it had been built. The lessons of Chaldiran, the purges of Tahmasp, and the strategies of survival were forgotten under the weight of incompetence and paranoia. The Safavid state, forged in blood and disciplined through decades of patient governance, had come perilously close to annihilation. The red-headed storm, once the symbol of unstoppable zeal, now symbolized the fragility of factional power. Provinces acted autonomously. Tribes challenged authority. Enemies encroached. The empire, strong under Tahmasp, was now a cautionary tale of how quickly chaos could return. And so, the curse of succession haunted Persia. It was a lesson written in blood, betrayal, and indecision, that the survival of an empire depended not only on armies, administration, and culture, but on the competence, vision, and authority of its rulers. Weakness at the top threatened to unravel centuries of hard-earned stability. The Safavid Empire survived, but barely. The ghosts of strong rulers passed, from Ismail's divine zeal to Tahmasp's patient mastery, loomed over the courts of Ismail II and Kotabanda. Their failures reminded all who witnessed them that an empire is only as strong as the ruler who sits upon its throne. Myth could inspire, strategy could preserve, but indecision and paranoia could undo everything. As the empire teetered on the brink, whispers of reform and stronger leadership began to circulate. Provinces, soldiers, and advisors all hoped for a return to decisive rule. A ruler who could restore order, discipline, and authority. The cycle of history had repeated itself. Survival achieved, but threatened again by succession. The Safavid state, for all its strength and sophistication, remained vulnerable to the human flaw at the heart of monarchy, the weakness of its rulers. The story of succession curses, of paranoia, weakness, and near collapse, became a lesson etched into the memory of Persia. An empire, no matter how carefully built, could be undone when leadership faltered. The Shahs who followed would remember these years, and the empire would learn again the importance of vigilance, authority, and competence. The Safavid Empire, strong in structure but fragile in leadership, survived. But it survived with scars, and with the haunting reminder that power, stability, and order are never guaranteed, not even in the most meticulously built of states. The palace of Kazvin was silent that morning, yet the air felt heavy, thick with tension and the lingering shadows of failure. In a darkened chamber, a boy of barely 16 years sat on the edge of a throne that felt far too large for his shoulders. Abbas, the son of Muhammad Qutbanda, had inherited an empire teetering on the edge of collapse. The weight of past misrule pressed down on him, a reminder that survival alone would never be enough. Outside, the empire breathed uneasily. Ottoman forces lingered near the western borders, emboldened by Persia's weakness. The Uzbeks prowled the northeast, raiding villages and testing defenses. And within, the Qizilbash, those same tribes that had built the red-headed storm, remained unpredictable, their loyalty fickle and their ambitions unchecked. Abbas understood, even at 16, that to rule an empire like this one, brute force alone could not suffice. He remembered the humiliations of the past. The Treaty of Istanbul, signed during his father's indecisive reign, had stripped Persia of territory and prestige. Provinces that had once bowed to the Shah now claimed autonomy. Merchants and governors whispered of the empire's weakness, and soldiers questioned whose orders they were meant to obey. Abbas, still young, had witnessed firsthand how fragile authority could be, and he had learned something crucial. Patience, more than courage, was the deadliest weapon. For years, Abbas remained a pawn in the court. Regents and advisors maneuvered around him. Qizilbash chiefs attempted to manipulate his decisions, and foreign envoys treated him as a child rather than the ruler of Persia. Yet he did not react with anger or rashness. He waited. Every insult, every slight, every limitation became a lesson in strategy. He observed the ambitions of his enemies, both within and without, noting their weaknesses as carefully as a general surveys the battlefield. Time itself became his ally, a weapon sharper than any sword. Abbas knew the real threat was not the Ottomans at the border or the Uzbeks in the northeast, it was the Qizilbash. The same tribal elites whose fanaticism had once built Persia, but whose independence now threatened to tear it apart. They were powerful, experienced, and unafraid to challenge a weak monarch. They had divided, betrayed, and even killed rulers who had underestimated their strength. Abbas understood that to restore the empire, he first had to understand, control, and ultimately outmaneuver them. He watched them, learned their patterns, listened to their whispers, and noted the rivalries that had persisted for decades. Their factions were predictable to those patient enough to study them. Abbas bided his time, quietly consolidating loyalists, cultivating administrators and military leaders who answered to him directly rather than to tribal allegiance. He observed the old red-headed storm, now fractured, and he waited for the moment when he could strike not with recklessness, but with precision. Patience was hard for a boy of 16. He had been raised with stories of Ismail's divinity, of the red-headed storm sweeping all before it, of heroes and mythic kings. Yet the reality of ruling Persia was harsher, more patient, more deliberate. He learned to restrain himself, to temper ambition with observation, and to let others reveal their weaknesses. Every conversation, every court meeting, every interaction became a test, a calculation, a way to map the loyalties and intentions of those around him. The young Shah's education was silent but relentless. Unlike his father, he did not inherit a throne weakened by indecision. He inherited an empire weakened by experience and misrule. Abbas learned the bitter lesson that authority could not be demanded, it had to be earned, often in silence. He learned that patience could prevent mistakes that a decade of impulsive action could not repair. And he learned that the most dangerous enemies often came from within, allies who acted as rivals, friends who carried the seeds of betrayal. Time, Abbas realized, was an instrument he could wield better than the sword. While the Ottomans and Uzbeks probed his borders, while Qizilbash chiefs jockeyed for position, he consolidated power quietly. Governors were appointed strategically, loyal administrators nurtured, and the fractured military gradually brought under his influence. Abbas was learning the art of survival and control, not through battle, but through the slow, deliberate accumulation of authority. And yet, the Boy King understood that the moment of action would come. Patience was a weapon, but only until it could be applied decisively. He would need to strike against the Qizilbash at the right moment, to reclaim the loyalty of fractured tribes, to assert the authority of the Shah, and to restore Persia's position in the region. Every day of waiting was preparation. Every slight, every insult, every whisper of rebellion was another lesson in how to wield power effectively. Even in moments of apparent weakness, Abbas projected.com. He learned to hide emotion, to observe rather than react, and to turn perception into leverage. Advisors who believed they controlled him soon realized that he was learning, watching, calculating, and waiting for the right moment. The boy who appeared powerless was already becoming a master strategist, understanding that empires are rarely won in a day, but can be lost in hours of rashness. Across Persia, the empire itself seemed to hold its breath. The scars of misrule, invasion, and civil strife were fresh. Yet under the silent watch of Abbas, the foundations of order were being reconstructed. Military discipline, bureaucratic authority, and administrative oversight were quietly strengthened. Provinces were not conquered, but loyalty was subtly reinforced. The empire was learning to survive again, and the boy king who waited was learning to rule. The Treaty of Istanbul, once a symbol of humiliation, became a lesson rather than a curse. Abbas studied it carefully, noting the concessions, the failures, and the power dynamics that had led to Persia's weakness. He understood that treaties were not just legal documents, they were instruments of statecraft, markers of balance, and reflections of authority. When the moment came to act, he would negotiate from strength, not weakness. And so, the Boy King waited. Every Kaiselbash faction, every tribal rival, every foreign observer was mapped in his mind. He bided his time, allowing his enemies to reveal their vulnerabilities, allowing his allies to prove their loyalty, and preparing himself to strike decisively when the moment arrived. Patience, strategic observation, and the quiet accumulation of power were his weapons. Abbas I, the Boy King, had inherited chaos. He had inherited humiliation, indecision, and fractured loyalty. Yet he understood that empires are not merely won by myth, zeal, or battle alone. They are preserved through time, patience, and the subtle mastery of human ambition. He waited, silent and calculating, until the moment arrived when he could transform Persia once again. And in that waiting, the seeds of a new Safavid Empire were sown, one that would rise stronger, disciplined, and resilient under the rule of a Shah who had learned that time itself could be the deadliest weapon in the arsenal of kings. The early morning sun fell in sharp beams across the training grounds outside Kazvin. Dust rose from the dry earth as soldiers marched in formation, their boots striking rhythmically, metal glinting under the pale light. At the edge of the field, Abbas I observed silently, a young man no longer content to wait. The Boy King, who had learned patience, had grown into a ruler who understood that survival alone could not preserve an empire. To secure Persia, he would need to break the old order entirely. The Kazilbash, for all their courage and fanaticism, were no longer enough. They had built the empire, but had also threatened its very survival. Tribal loyalty was volatile, factional disputes were endless, and their independence had caused centuries of instability. Abbas knew that if Persia was to endure, the balance of power had to shift. The red-headed storm would not be destroyed, it could not be, but it could be controlled. And to do so, he needed a force that owed loyalty to him alone. Enter the Ghulams, the third force. Abbas envisioned a new army, one removed from tribal politics, independent of factional allegiances, and fiercely loyal to the Shah himself. These slave soldiers were recruited from the Caucasus, Georgians, Circassians, and Armenians, young men taken far from their homelands and raised under strict discipline within the Safavid court. They would be trained, educated, and indoctrinated to serve only one master, Abbas. The creation of this army was more than a military innovation. It was a revolution in governance. Training the Ghulams was no simple matter. They were drilled daily, their movements precise, their skills honed under the watchful eyes of European military advisors whom Abbas had invited to the empire. Muskets and cannons, once novelties in Persia, became standard tools in his arsenal. Soldiers learned formations, volley fire, and the deadly coordination that turned individual zeal into collective efficiency. The Kazilbash, with their courage and swords, were formidable in battle. But Abbas's new force would combine discipline, strategy, and gunpowder to reshape warfare in Persia. The palace workshops were abuzz with a different kind of activity. Artisans crafted gunpowder weapons, cannons, and muskets to equip the new army. Blacksmiths worked night and day, creating armor, blades, and tools for the Ghulams. The hum of industry, the smell of heated metal, and the crackle of powder in testing fields became the soundtrack of Persia's transformation. Abbas understood that power rested not just in armies, but in technology and organization. Observers at the court were uncertain. The Kazilbash watched with suspicion, wary of this new third force that threatened their dominance. They grumbled in private, questioning the loyalty of the slaves and the wisdom of European tactics. But Abbas was patient. He knew that perception could be as powerful as action. By demonstrating the effectiveness of the Ghulams in training and small engagements, he would gradually shift confidence away from the tribal factions and toward a force that answered only to the Shah. The Ghulams were more than soldiers. They were instruments of loyalty and instruments of statecraft. Each man's identity was stripped of tribal ties and forged anew under Abbas's guidance. They spoke the language of command, followed orders without hesitation, and believed in the Shah's authority as absolute. Where the Kazilbash fought with faith in divine sanction and tribal pride, the Ghulams fought with discipline, training, and the certainty of belonging to a force beyond factionalism. European advisors contributed more than tactics. They brought knowledge of fortifications, battlefield strategy, and the science of gunpowder. Muskets replaced arrows. Cannons reshaped sieges. The Safavid army, long reliant on the bravery of individuals and the chaos of tribal charges, was becoming something new, a modern professional army capable of executing coordinated maneuvers with precision. Abbas watched these transformations with satisfaction, knowing that each step undermined the Kazilbash's monopoly on military power. The reform was not without resistance. Tribal leaders attempted to bribe, intimidate, and undermine the Some Kazilbash units refused orders, testing the loyalty of Abbas's new recruits. But the Shah responded with both subtlety and decisiveness. Those who resisted were removed quietly or reassigned to the periphery of the empire. The message was clear. Loyalty to the Shah was paramount. Tribal loyalty would no longer dictate the fate of Persia. As the years passed, the third force grew in strength and sophistication. Ghulams became a visible counterbalance to the Qizilbash, ensuring that no single faction could dominate the state. Their loyalty was absolute, their training unmatched, and their presence a constant reminder that Abbas ruled not by the chaotic devotion of tribal warriors, but through calculated, disciplined, and strategic authority. This revolution extended beyond the battlefield. Provinces that had once relied on tribal enforcement now recognized the Shah's authority directly. Governors were chosen for merit and loyalty, not tribal affiliation. The empire's revenue system became more reliable, its administration more cohesive, and its borders more defensible. Abbas had transformed Persia into a state where power flowed from the throne itself, not from factional allegiances. The Ghulams became symbols as much as soldiers. Their presence in the capital, in the palace, and on campaign sent a message to every corner of the empire. The era of tribal dominance had ended. The Shah was supreme, and authority was centralized. Fanaticism and loyalty to the Qizilbash would no longer dictate the fate of Persia. Instead, a disciplined, professional, and strategically trained army would uphold the empire. Abbas's reforms also extended to tactics. The combination of disciplined infantry, artillery, and cavalry trained under European methods created a synergy previously unseen in Persia. Battles could now be won not only through courage and zeal, but through coordinated firepower and strategy. The empire, once reliant on the unpredictable loyalty of tribes, was now anchored by modern military organization. Gunpowder became the language of power, and Abbas became fluent in its command. The Third Force Revolution, as it would later be called, reshaped the Safavid Empire permanently. It broke the centuries-old stranglehold of the Qizilbash, created an army loyal to the Shah alone, and introduced modern military technology and discipline. Persia's borders were now defendable, and the central authority of the Shah became indisputable. The empire that had once been at the mercy of factionalism and chaos was transformed into a state, capable of enduring internal and external challenges alike. Abbas I, the boy who had once waited, had become the master of time and strategy. He had used patience, observation, and cunning to outmaneuver tribal factions. He had built a third force loyal only to him, incorporating technology, discipline, and foreign expertise. Persia's survival was no longer a gamble on fanaticism or tribal allegiance. It was engineered through reform, strategy, and absolute loyalty. The Ghulams marched in formation, muskets ready, cannons poised, eyes fixed on the horizon. The red-headed storm still existed, proud and fearless, but it was now tempered, controlled, and subordinated. The empire had found balance, not through myth alone, not through zeal alone, but through the careful creation of a modern professional army, a third force that would secure the future of Persia. And in the quiet of the training fields, Abbas watched, patient and calculating. Time had been his ally. Observation had been his teacher. And now, the tools of discipline, loyalty, and gunpowder were his instruments. The boy king who waited had created a revolution, one that would define the Safavid Empire for generations. The air over the plains of Persia was thick with anticipation. Drums echoed across the camp, and the metallic scent of polished weapons mingled with the dust rising from the marching columns. Abbas the Great, now a man in his prime, stood atop a small hill, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had waited, observed, and planned for years. The boy king, who had once been patient and silent, had grown into a master of war, strategy, and authority. Today, the Safavid Empire would rise from the ashes of chaos. The first target was the Qizilbash. The tribes who had built Persia's armies were now fractured, their loyalty divided among ambitious chiefs. Abbas had prepared for this carefully. He knew their pride, their impulsive courage, and their dependence on factional rivalry. His new army of Ghulams, disciplined, loyal, and trained in the deadly coordination of European warfare, would act as the hammer to break the tribal anvil. When the first clash came, it was swift and decisive. The Qizilbash, confident in their numbers and valor, charged, expecting to overwhelm the Shah's smaller force. But discipline won. Ghulams held their formations, fired coordinated volleys, and struck with precision. The tribes were stunned. Courage alone could not overcome strategy, technology, and absolute loyalty. By the end of the day, the Qizilbash were tamed, their power curtailed, and their place firmly under Abbas's command. With internal unity secured, Abbas turned his gaze outward. The Uzbeks in the northeast had grown bold during years of Safavid weakness, raiding cities and plundering villages. Abbas moved with speed and calculated force. Columns of infantry and cavalry swept across the plains, crushing the invaders before they could consolidate. Villages were secured, cities reinforced, and border fortifications strengthened. Abbas's genius was in combining strategy with speed, striking before the enemy could react, leaving them disoriented and defeated. Persia's lost lands, ceded or abandoned during decades of weak rule, were next. Cities that had slipped from the empire's grasp were carefully reconquered, not merely through brute force, but through calculated diplomacy paired with military presence. Abbas restored governors loyal to him, secured trade routes, and rebuilt infrastructure damaged by years of neglect. Every victory, every recaptured city, was a message. The empire was strong again, and its authority absolute. But the greatest challenge lay to the west. The Ottomans, long Persia's rival, controlled Baghdad and coveted the Persian Gulf. Abbas knew that direct confrontation would be dangerous, but he also knew that delay was costly. He gathered his forces, blending the newly disciplined ghulams with the traditional cavalry, artillery units, and skilled engineers. The stage was set for one of the most ambitious campaigns in Safavid history. The war with the Ottomans was brutal and unrelenting. Artillery thundered, muskets cracked, and the disciplined formations of Abbas' army tested the Ottoman forces in ways they had not encountered before. The ghulams, loyal and well-trained, became the spearhead of the campaign, striking with precision, while Abbas himself directed maneuvers from the field. His strategy was relentless: divide, encircle, and conquer, leaving no opportunity for the Ottomans to regroup. Baghdad, the prize, was a fortress of both military and symbolic importance. Its walls were strong, its garrison seasoned, and its defenders confident. But Abbas was patient. Siege engines were deployed, artillery pounded the walls, and coordinated assaults weakened the city's defenses. Months of strategy and discipline culminated in a final, decisive strike. The gates fell. Abbas entered Baghdad, not as a conqueror simply, but as a ruler asserting rightful authority over Persian lands. Control of Baghdad meant more than military glory. It was a gateway to the Persian Gulf, a corridor of trade, influence, and economic power. Abbas understood that an empire's strength rested not only on conquest, but on the flow of wealth and resources. Ports were fortified, merchant routes secured, and customs enforced. Persia now controlled vital trade corridors, ensuring that the empire's wealth would flow into the hands of the central authority rather than disparate tribal chiefs. Abbas's genius was in combining force with strategy. The Qizilbash were no longer an independent threat. The Uzbeks had been repelled and lost territories reclaimed. The Ottomans, humbled by the siege of Baghdad, recognized the resurgence of Safavid power. And Persia, once fractured and vulnerable, now stood as a state that could command respect, project influence, and defend itself against multiple adversaries simultaneously. The people of Persia watched this transformation with awe and fear. Where once the empire had been at the mercy of indecision and weak leadership, now authority was absolute, disciplined, and visible. Governors acted decisively, troops followed orders, and trade flourished under secure routes. Abbas had not only restored the empire's borders, but had also restored confidence in the institution of the monarchy itself. Abbas's reforms extended beyond the battlefield. Fortresses were modernized, armies trained, and administration centralized. Trade routes became arteries of wealth, connecting Persia internally and externally. Cultural and religious institutions were stabilized, aligning the Shia ideology with the renewed power of the state. Persia's resurgence was complete. Military, economic, and symbolic authority were now inseparable, reinforcing each other in a cycle of enduring power. By the time Abbas returned to Qazvin, the empire was unrecognizable from the chaos he had inherited. Where Qizilbash factions once dictated the fate of rulers, loyalty was now to the Shah alone. Where borderlands were raided with impunity, fortifications and disciplined forces ensured security. Where trade routes had been disrupted by disorder, ports and customs now generated wealth for the empire. Abbas had transformed Persia into a modern, resilient state capable of surviving internal and external pressures alike. The Shah stood on the ramparts of Baghdad, looking out over the river and the bustling markets beyond. The empire had been battered, fractured, and humiliated. Now, it thrived. Every victory, every reform, every carefully calculated move had brought Persia back from the brink. Abbas had unleashed the full potential of his genius, the patience of a boy who waited, the strategy of a master tactician, and the ruthlessness of a ruler determined to ensure that Persia would never again be weak. And as the sun set over the plains, casting long shadows across the walls of Baghdad, Abbas knew the truth he had long understood: an empire is won through strategy, loyalty, and the disciplined application of power. Glory and zeal inspire, but authority, organization, and vision endure. Persia was no longer a fragile state at the mercy of factions and chaos. It was a restored empire, strong, disciplined, and under the command of a Shah who would be remembered as Abiash the Great. The first rays of dawn spilled over the Zayandeh River, reflecting golden light off the newly built domes and minarets of Isfahan. Abbas the Great stood on the banks, watching the city awaken. Horses clattered across stone bridges, merchants arranged bolts of silk, and craftsmen opened their workshops. What had once been a provincial town was now the beating heart of an empire city that would be remembered as half the world. The decision to relocate the capital from Qazvin to Isfahan was more than strategic, it was symbolic. Abbas wanted the empire made visible. Where once authority had been abstract and distant, now it could be seen, felt, and measured in the grandeur of streets, squares, and palaces. The heart of the empire would be a stage on which the Shah's power, sophistication, and vision were performed daily. At the center of it all, Naqshi Jahan Square stretched vast and open, a breathtaking testament to Safavid ambition. Surrounded by mosques, palaces, and bazaars, the square was not merely a civic space, it was an instrument of authority. Every procession, every gathering, every performance reinforced the presence of the Shah. Merchants displayed foreign silks, spices, and carpets, connecting Isfahan to trade routes stretching across Asia and into Europe. Wealth, culture, and power flowed through this central artery of the city. Abbas himself was both performer and ruler. He moved through the square with calculated visibility, inspecting troops, attending Friday prayers, and overseeing commerce. Every gesture projected control and charisma. Diplomats, traders, and citizens alike understood that the Shah's authority was omnipresent. Architecture, trade, and ceremony became inseparable tools of governance. Trade flourished. Silk caravans arrived from distant lands. Ports thrived under Abbas's reforms, and Isfahan became a nexus of global commerce. The city was both palace and marketplace, mosque and forum, spectacle and instrument of state. Abbas had transformed space into a symbol, showing that Persia was no longer fragmented or hidden. It was centralized, prosperous, and undeniably powerful. As the sun set behind the turquoise domes, Abbas looked over Naqshi Jahan Square and smiled. He had made the empire visible, tangible, and enduring. Persia could now be seen and admired, not only by its citizens but by the world beyond. In Isfahan, half the world was not just a name, it was a reality, a triumph of vision, power, and the art of ruling. The corridors of the palace in Isfahan were eerily silent, the air thick with fear. Abbas the Great, the master strategist, the conqueror of empires, moved through them with calculated steps. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow was measured. Paranoia had become as much a tool of rule as cannon or cavalry. The Shah's absolute authority had a cost, a price paid in blood, in family, and in the future of Persia. It began with Safavid Mirza, one of his own sons. Rumors of disloyalty, however faint, were enough. Abbas, who had once tamed tribes and defeated foreign armies, now turned his meticulous discipline inward. Safavid Mirza was executed quietly, his death a warning that no one, not even blood, could challenge the Shah's supremacy. The lesson was clear: loyalty to the state, to the Shah, above all else. Love, family, or tradition mattered little in the calculus of survival. But one act was never enough. Abbas's suspicion extended to his other heirs. Princes were blinded, confined, and removed from the corridors of power. The palace became a golden cage, where wealth and comfort masked imprisonment, and safety came at the cost of independence. The Shah's genius for strategy now veered into obsession. Every potential rival, every flicker of ambition, was extinguished before it could threaten him. For the empire, the consequences were slow but deadly. In the short term, Abbas's paranoia ensured stability. Tribes and generals alike recognized that the throne was absolute, and rebellion became rare. Order was enforced with ruthless efficiency, and the machinery of the state ran like a well-oiled clock. The Ghulams were loyal, the bureaucracy disciplined, and the empire outwardly strong. Yet the long-term price was far greater. By destroying his own heirs, Abbas created a vacuum of leadership for the future. The crown was safe under his hand, but fragile in the generations to come. The empire, disciplined and centralized, now faced a succession crisis that no army, no bureaucracy, no walls could prevent. Fear preserved the present, but it imperiled the future. As Abbas watched the city of Isfahan shimmer under the evening sun, the grand mosques casting shadows across Naqshi Jahan Square, he understood that absolute control came with a paradox. Power secured in the moment could sow instability for decades. The Shah had built, conquered, and centralized, but he had also imprisoned his own lineage. The golden cage glittered, but its bars would be felt by Persia long after the conqueror's shadow faded. The palace in Isfahan glimmered with gold and marble, a jewel of the Safavid Empire. But behind the splendor, the heartbeat of Persia was weakening. The courts, once disciplined and fearsome under Abbas the Great, had become chambers of intrigue, comfort, and decadence. Kings sat on thrones, surrounded by luxury, yet powerless to command the very empire their ancestors had built. Persia's rulers had become kings without kingship. It began with the harem. Women of royal blood, concubines, and powerful mothers were no longer silent figures. Behind the curtain, they became architects of policy, manipulators of succession, and arbiters of influence. Decisions once made on strategy, diplomacy, or merit were now filtered through court intrigue. Alliances were brokered not on the battlefield, but in the private chambers of the palace, where whispers could seal the fate of ministers, generals, and even princes. Eunuchs, long trusted as loyal servants and guardians of the harem, rose in power. They controlled access to the Shah, shaped opinions, and brokered favors. Once disciplined and loyal, they now wielded influence that rivaled the throne itself. Ministers and governors found themselves answering less to the monarch and more to the shifting allegiances of palace factions. Decisions became fragmented, inconsistent, and often self-serving. The heirs to the throne, raised in luxury and isolation, were untested by the harsh lessons that had forged the empire. They had not known siege, battle, or rebellion. Their education in the realities of governance was superficial, confined to ceremonial rituals, poetry, and courtly etiquette. When the time came to wield authority, they lacked the courage, skill, and strategic thinking of Abbas. The empire, disciplined and centralized by one man, now faced rulers ill-prepared to maintain it. The military edge, once the pride of Persia, began to erode. The Ghulams, loyal and disciplined under Abbas, were still competent, but new generations lacked the rigor and intensity of the first recruits. Training standards slipped. Officers were promoted based on favoritism or factional loyalty rather than merit. Meanwhile, the Qizilbash, though tamed, quietly nursed old rivalries. Without strong leadership, old tribal feuds resurfaced beneath the surface, eroding unity. Corruption spread like a slow poison. Governors skimmed revenues, merchants paid bribes to bypass regulations, and provincial administrators ignored central authority. The bureaucratic machine, once precise and efficient, now groaned under nepotism, factionalism, and complacency. Court ceremonies dazzled visitors, but behind the spectacle, the wheels of government were grinding to a halt. Persia's wealth, once a tool of centralized power, now fed factional greed and personal ambition. Foreign observers noticed the change. Ottoman and Uzbek spies reported not on battlefields, but on palace intrigues, on eunuchs controlling access to the Shah, on princes more concerned with leisure than governance. Persia as enemies no longer feared its military as much as they watched its weakened and distracted court. The empire, outwardly glorious, had become vulnerable in its very heart. The palace, the psychological effect on the people, was equally profound. Citizens no longer trusted the crown to enforce justice consistently. Soldiers, once inspired by loyalty and the Shah's authority, became disillusioned. Merchants and governors, sensing weakness, acted independently, sometimes openly defying royal edicts. The Safavid Empire, meticulously built by visionaries and warriors, now depended on rituals, appearances, and inherited authority rather than skill, strategy, or decisiveness. This era of kings without kingship marked a slow decline, a departure from the deliberate strength of previous rulers. Harem politics dictated succession. Eunuchs and factions manipulated governance. Princes, untested and inexperienced, inherited power but lacked the ability to wield it effectively. Military readiness faltered, and corruption became entrenched. Persia's outward grandeur masked a state growing fragile from within. The palace sparkled, the mosques soared, and Isfahan dazzled foreign eyes. Yet beneath the marble floors and gilded domes, the foundations of the empire were cracking. Kings ruled, but they did not govern. Thrones existed, but authority had diminished. The Safavid state, once disciplined, feared, and respected, was becoming a collection of factions, comfort, and spectacle, a kingdom without kingship, where power was inherited, but not exercised. As the sun set over the domes and minarets, shadows fell across the square. The streets remained bustling, trade continued, and the empire appeared alive. But the true strength of Persia, the decisiveness, discipline, and authority of a ruling monarch, was waning. Harem intrigues, eunuch manipulations, inexperienced princes, and creeping corruption had begun to erode the glory of Abbas the Great. Persia remained powerful in appearance, but vulnerable in reality, and the stage was set for the challenges that would define its next century. The grand mosques of Isfahan rang with the sound of prayer. But beneath the echoing calls, a different kind of power was taking root. The Safavid Empire, once forged through blood, strategy, and charisma, was now being reshaped by devotion, and not devotion tempered by the Shah's authority, but by the rising orthodoxy of the Shia clergy. The empire's spiritual foundations, once a tool of statecraft, were becoming its prison. It began subtly. Scholars, previously advisors and allies of the Shah, started asserting influence over more than religion. They dictated law, education, and morality. Friday sermons became vehicles for ideological instruction, reinforcing not only faith but obedience to clerical authority. The Ghulams and administrators, once loyal to the Shah above all else, learned to navigate a new landscape where piety could rival political power. In the shadow of the minarets, the Safavid state was losing control over the spiritual narrative that had built it. The Sufis, the very mystics who had once guided and inspired the Safavid rise, were increasingly marginalized. Their teachings, fluid and esoteric, clashed with the rigid orthodoxy now enforced by clerics. Orders that had once been tolerated or even supported were suppressed, their leaders executed or exiled. The spiritual diversity that had allowed the empire to adapt, inspire loyalty, and incorporate new territories began to vanish under the weight of dogma. Non-Shia communities faced an even harsher reality. Sunnis, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians found themselves pressured to conform, taxed heavily, or excluded from positions of influence. Religious uniformity became a tool of control, but also a cage. Where faith had once united tribes, inspired armies, and legitimized the Shah, it now constricted freedom, stifled innovation, and replaced adaptability with rigidity. The genius of the Safavid model, melding devotion with pragmatic governance, was being dismantled from within. The court itself was transformed. Scholars and jurists increasingly dictated succession, policy, and education. Princes were instructed not only in statecraft, but in the meticulous enforcement of orthodoxy. Rulers who might have relied on strategic vision or military skill now deferred to clerical authority, recognizing that defiance could invite ideological and spiritual rebellion. Faith had become both shield and cage for the monarchy. This clerical rise came with paradoxical consequences. On one hand, the empire's religious identity became clear and unified. Persia was unmistakably Shia, its rituals codified, its law grounded in doctrine. On the other hand, the empire's flexibility, the very quality that had allowed Abbas the Great to conquer, innovate, and modernize, was lost. Military reforms, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic subtlety began to bow before ideological rigidity. Commanders deferred to scholars, merchants feared doctrinal oversight, and provincial governors hesitated to act without clerical approval. The people, too, felt the shift. Where once the Shah had been the embodiment of both temporal and spiritual power, now his influence was increasingly mediated by clerics. Loyalty was not to the throne, but to doctrine. Tribes and communities learned that survival meant adherence to rules and ritual, not innovation or allegiance to a living ruler. Faith, once a weapon and a unifying tool, had become a cage, and yet the empire endured. Walls, armies, and bureaucracy remained strong, and trade continued. But Persia was no longer dynamic. It was rigid. Dogma replaced adaptability. Orthodoxy replaced mysticism. The Safavid state, once built on a delicate balance of charisma, military innovation, and flexible belief, now rested on rules that allowed little room for evolution. Abbas the Great had centralized power, forged loyalty, and rebuilt the empire. But the generations that followed, increasingly guided by clerical authority, would inherit a state where faith constrained action. The same religion that had legitimized kingship now dictated it. The Safavid spirit, the fusion of mysticism, zeal, and pragmatism, was fading. Persia's genius was preserved in stone, silk, and ritual, but the living dynamism that had created it was being imprisoned behind theological walls. By the end of the century, the Safavid Empire remained formidable, its cities glittering, its armies disciplined, and its borders secure. Yet the soul of the state, the blend of flexibility, vision, and charisma that had allowed the rise of Ismail and the triumphs of Abbas, was overshadowed by an unyielding clerical authority. Faith had become both crown and cage, protecting the empire while quietly limiting its future. In Isfahan's silent libraries, bustling mosques, and quiet courts, the clerics wrote the new rules. They shaped a Persia where obedience to God replaced obedience to the Shah, where ritual replaced strategy, and where the vibrant, adaptive genius of the Safavid founders slowly gave way to rigid orthodoxy. The empire was powerful, disciplined, and deeply Shia, but the freedom, creativity, and dynamism that had forged its greatness were trapped behind invisible bars of faith. The desert wind swept across Kandahar, carrying the scent of dust, fire, and rebellion. Abbas's grand legacy had endured for decades, yet even the mightiest empires have blind spots. In the southeastern fringes of Persia, far from Isfahan's gleaming domes and bustling bazaars, a storm was quietly brewing. It would not arrive on horseback with trumpets, but in the hearts of a people pushed to Faran, enemy forged not by ambition alone, but by intolerance. The Pashtun tribes of Kandahar had long lived under Safavid rule, but the empire's insistence on rigid Shia orthodoxy had created more enemies than subjects. Sunni communities were pressured to convert, Sufi practices suppressed, and local leaders replaced by administrators loyal to clerics and distant governors. Faith, which had once united Persia, now alienated its borders. The policies of the central state had made the once loyal tribes question whether obedience was survival or submission. Among them, one man rose with vision and fury, Mirway Hotak, a chieftain by birth and a devout Sunni by faith. He understood that the Safavid grip could be broken, not merely by armies, but by exploiting the moral and spiritual fracture they had created. He rallied tribes around the simple yet devastating truth. The empire's strength came at the expense of their identity. Forced conversion and oppression were sins that justified rebellion. Faith, twisted into a weapon by distant clerics, became the very sword they would use to strike back. Mirway's rebellion was not sudden, it was meticulous. He cultivated loyalty, coordinated disparate Pashtun tribes, and studied the weaknesses of the Safavid governors in Kandahar. He exploited every misstep, a tax collector too harsh, a local officer too arrogant, a garrison unprepared for local resistance. Abbas's successors, distracted by court intrigue, eunuchs and palace factions, were blind to the mounting threat on the empire's periphery. Kandahar simmered, while Isfahan remained oblivious. The first strikes were swift and symbolic. Safavid garrisons were overrun, governors assassinated, and local Shia officials forced to flee. The rebellion was framed not merely as political defiance, but as a religious duty. Hotak presented himself as a defender of Sunni Islam, a protector of the faithful against a state that had twisted religion into a tool of oppression. His message resonated across the borderlands, drawing not just warriors but entire communities into the fold of resistance. The empire's response was predictable yet tragic. Reinforcements were sent, orders relayed from Isfahan, and loyal troops dispatched to quell the uprising. But the distance, combined with unfamiliar terrain and a population united by faith and grievance, made conventional military power ineffective. Discipline and gunpowder could not easily subdue zeal shaped by years of persecution. Each Safavid attempt to reclaim Kandahar only strengthened the resolve of Hotak's followers. By the time news reached the capital, Mirwais had not only secured control of Kandahar, but had sent ripples of fear through Persia. The once invincible Safavid authority built on conquest, discipline, and centralized power was being undermined by the very policies that had ensured its short-term stability. Forced conversions and rigid orthodoxy, intended to consolidate power, had created an enemy whose legitimacy was rooted in religion itself. The Afghan blade, as it would later be remembered, was sharper than any cannon or sword forged in Islam. Mirwais Hotak had not simply rebelled, he had exploited a fundamental truth of governance. When belief is enforced rather than inspired, when faith is weaponized, the oppressed will eventually wield it as vengeance. The Safavid Empire, still outwardly magnificent, now faced a peril that could not be subdued through wealth, ceremony, or even military might. In the courts of Isfahan, whispers spread, governors debated strategies, clerics counseled caution, and eunuchs urged patience. Yet the lesson was clear. The empire had created its own nemesis. The Afghan blade was born not from foreign ambition, but from the Safavid state's intolerance and inflexibility. Kandahar's sands would soon claim more than garrisons. They would carve cracks into the empire itself. Mirwais's rebellion was a mirror held up to Persia. The same rigidity that had stabilized the heart of the empire had destabilized its margins. The Safavids, masters of order and orthodoxy, had underestimated the cost of control. Faith, once a unifying force, now cut against them, leaving an empire both magnificent and dangerously vulnerable. As the sun set over Kandahar, casting long shadows across the arid plains, the Afghan tribes celebrated victory, while the Safavid court trembled. The blade of rebellion, forged in years of enforced belief, had been unleashed. Persia would learn, too late, that the enemies created by intolerance are often the sharpest and most enduring. The morning air over the plains outside Isfahan carried an unfamiliar tension. Drums of war beat in the distance, but there was no echo of Persian discipline, no disciplined formations of ghulams marching in precision. The Afghan army was approaching, not with fanfare, but with inevitability. The streets of the capital shimmered with the illusion of order. But beneath the surface, the empire's heart was trembling. It began at Golnabad, a field some 30 kilometers east of the city. The Afghan forces under Mahmud Hotak, successor of the legendary Mirwais, had grown bold, disciplined, and hungry for victory. The Safavid army, though still formidable in appearance, was fractured. Years of court intrigue, eunuch dominance, and inexperienced princes had sapped morale. The battle that followed was swift, brutal, and decisive. Persian troops, poorly coordinated, were overwhelmed by the Afghans' disciplined, motivated ranks. The red-headed storm of centuries past had been reduced to fractured units, and the illusions of invincibility shattered under the relentless Afghan charge. The remnants of Abbas's once proud army fled back to the city, and Isfahan braced for a siege unlike any it had known. Gates were reinforced, walls inspected, and citizens hurried to store food and water. Yet the city's defenses could not conceal the cracks that had been growing for decades. Administrative inefficiency, dependence on a fragile court, and a populace increasingly alienated by religious rigidity. The Afghans were no ordinary invaders. They carried the weight of collective grievance and a disciplined will honed by decades of resistance. As the siege began, the city's golden streets quickly lost their glamour. Starvation became the first weapon of the invaders. Merchants who had once filled Isfahan squares with silk and spices were unable to supply the masses. Markets emptied, horses were slaughtered for food, livestock consumed, and the once bustling city grew silent with hunger. Families huddled in homes, rationing what little they had. The wealth and architecture that had symbolized Abbas's triumphs could not feed a hungry city. Disease followed hunger swiftly. Water supplies stagnated under siege conditions, while malnutrition weakened the population. Typhus, dysentery, and fever spread through the streets, claiming children and elders alike. The hospitals, designed for routine care, were overwhelmed. Mortality soared. The city that had once dazzled travelers with its mosques, palaces, and fountains was now a shadow of its former glorious city, trapped in a nightmare of moral and physical collapse. In desperation, some citizens resorted to acts that would haunt history. Reports of cannibalism surfaced, whispered in the alleys and marketplaces. Survival had become the only law, and even that was uncertain. The Afghans, meanwhile, maintained pressure, tightening their grip around the walls, cutting off escape, and reminding the Persians that this siege was as much a psychological weapon as a military one. Inside the palace, the Safavid elite grappled with fear and denial. Princes huddled in chambers, eunuchs debated strategy, and clerics preached obedience and divine providence. Yet faith alone could not fill stomachs or repel siege engines. The state apparatus, once a sophisticated machine under ABAs, had become paralyzed by factionalism, overconfidence, and years of complacency. The illusion of control was crumbling, and the city's citizens were its first victims. The Afghans exploited every weakness. They harassed supply lines, ambushed small parties, and sent spies into the city to foment fear. Night raids spread panic. Every attempt to organize defense met with confusion. Leadership was fractured, communication slow, and morale near zero. The once proud army of the Shah now huddled behind walls, unsure if courage, discipline, or prayer could save them. For weeks, the siege dragged on. Citizens grew gaunt, walls were defended by skeletal crews, and every day brought new deaths from starvation or disease. Letters to the provinces, begging for reinforcements, were delayed or ignored, as distant governors were embroiled in their own conflicts or paralyzed by bureaucratic inefficiency. Persia, once a unified empire of formidable power, had become a city besieged, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. The psychological impact was profound. Fear replaced hope. The Shah, a figurehead now overshadowed by clerical influence and court intrigue, could not inspire confidence. Children no longer played in the squares. Merchants no longer bargained in the bazaars. The call to prayer rang hollow when stomachs were empty and disease claimed families. Isfahan, half the world, had become half a city, trapped in the vice of inevitability. Finally, the Waz gave way not through siege engines, but through desperation. The city's defenders, weakened by hunger and disease, could no longer maintain coordinated resistance. On a grim morning, Afghan forces entered Isfahan, not as conquerors striking from a distance, but as masters of a city that had surrendered in every sense, physically, morally, and spiritually. What followed was a collapse that echoed across the empire. The Safavid court, eunuchs, princes, and clerics were powerless to stop the looting, executions, and occupation. Citizens faced reprisals, forced labor, and humiliation. The grandeur of Isfahan, which had once symbolized the genius of Abbas the Great, now became a stark illustration of the empire's fragility. The siege of Isfahan was more than a military defeat. It was the final demonstration of a century-long truth. Centralized power, wealth, and religious authority could maintain control only if legitimacy, loyalty, and flexibility were preserved. Persia had lost its dynamism. Its enemies, once distant and fragmented, now struck decisively. The empire that Abbas the Great had restored and rebuilt was collapsing under the weight of intolerance, internal decay, and mismanagement. As the dust settled over Isfahan, the city that had once been half the world now lay in shadow. The Afghans had cut through the illusion of power, leaving behind a city and an empire struggling to survive. Starvation, disease, fear, and death had hollowed the streets. Persia's illusion of invincibility was shattered. The empire had been defeated not just by armies, but by the decades of accumulated mistakes, rigid orthodoxy, and weakened leadership that had made the Afghan blade inevitable. The siege had ended, but the consequences would linger for decades. Persia's center of power had fallen, its people traumatized, and its state apparatus fractured. The Afghan conquest of Isfahan marked the collapse of the Safavid dream, the final moment when illusion yielded to reality, and when a once mighty empire discovered that glory and discipline are fragile when vision, loyalty, and humanity are lost. The streets of Isfahan were silent, but the silence carried the weight of centuries. The golden domes of Nakshi Jahan Square no longer shimmered. With pride, they reflected the gloom of a city broken by hunger, fear, and betrayal. The Afghans had marched through Kandahar, overrun Persian defenses, and now the heart of the Safavid Empire was exposed, vulnerable, and crumbling. The empire that Abbas the Great had rebuilt with iron and vision was now facing its final hour. Shah Sultan Hussein, once the figurehead of the most illustrious dynasty Persia had ever known, sat in the palace with a hollow crown on his head. He had inherited a kingdom that gleamed outwardly but decayed inwardly. Years of complacency, clerical dominance, and court intrigue had hollowed his authority. The armies he commanded were demoralized, his generals indecisive, and his people exhausted. The Shah's advisors whispered of surrender, but he hesitated, torn between pride and the inevitable. The decisive moment came at the gates of Isfahan. Afghan forces, disciplined, motivated, and unrelenting, surrounded the city. Mahmud Hotak, the successor to Mirwais, did not offer mercy lightly. The siege had already starved the city, spread disease, and broken morale. Now, he demanded submission. Sultan Hussein, facing the stark reality that resistance would mean death for tens of thousands, finally capitulated. The gates were opened not by force, but by despair. Persia's golden capital had fallen. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Eunuchs, ministers, and clerics scrambled to negotiate, to protect themselves, or to flee. Soldiers surrendered their weapons, merchants abandoned shops, and ordinary citizens, weary from weeks of famine and fear, watched as foreign banners rose over their city. The Afghans did not merely conquer it, they occupied. Safavid authority, once absolute, was erased in hours. The surrender of Sultan Hussein was more than the fall of a king, it was the symbolic end of the Safavid dynasty. Centuries of ambition, conquest, and cultural achievement dissolved in a single act of submission. The golden streets of Isfahan, which had reflected the brilliance of Abbas the Great and the vision of a unified Persia, now mirrored the shadow of defeat. The empire's institutions, once disciplined and centralized, were powerless under Afghan occupation. Persia itself, vast and diverse, felt the tremors immediately. Provinces that had only recently been reintegrated now questioned loyalty. Tribal leaders, long controlled by Safavid authority, asserted independence. Borders that had been defended by Abbas's armies became porous. The carefully constructed state that had unified warriors, merchants, scholars, and clerics fractured almost overnight. The illusion of strength, the appearance of half the world was gone. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of the Safavids lingered. The cultural achievements, the mosques, palaces, squares, and public works remained. Isfahan's architecture, its urban planning, and its trade networks continued to awe visitors long after the Shah's surrender. But the state itself, the fragile web of loyalty, military power, and centralized governance, had been shattered. Persia was once again a land divided, vulnerable, and ripe for exploitation. The Afghans, masters of the city, imposed their rule with harsh efficiency. Clerical influence persisted, but now it served a foreign power. Families mourned, lost members, communities struggled to survive. And the population of Isfahan bore witness to the consequences of decades of weak leadership, rigid orthodoxy, and internal decay. The golden age of the Safavids had ended not with glory, but with surrender, starvation, and despair. Shah Sultan Hussein, a man who had inherited an empire built by visionaries and warriors, lived the final years of his reign in captivity and humiliation. The crowns of his forefathers, the streets of half the world, and the armies that once inspired awe were gone. The Safavid Empire, which had united Persia under faith, strategy, and discipline, was no more. Persia, fractured and battered, would slowly recover under new dynasties, but the memory of the Safavids lingered. A dynasty that had risen from mystics and warriors, reached unprecedented heights under Abbas, and fallen because of complacency, intolerance, and internal decay. The surrender of Isfahan marked the end of half the world, the collapse of Safavid authority, and a return to fragmentation, leaving Persia vulnerable once again to the storms of history. As the sun set behind Isfahan's domes, the Afghans raised their banners over the city, and the streets fell silent. The empire's illusion of invincibility had been shattered. Persia had survived, but the Safavid dream, the fusion of faith, power, and culture, was now a memory. Half the world had fallen, and with it, the glory of a dynasty that had once reshaped an empire. As the dust of battles settled, and the echoes of Isfahan's gates closing faded into history, one truth remained undeniable. The Safavid dynasty had changed Iran forever. From the mystics of Ardabil to the grandeur of Abbas's Isfahan, from the Qizilbash warriors to the rise of Shia orthodoxy, the Safavids were architects of an identity that endures to this day. They had taken chaos, tribal rivalries, and fragmented lands and forged them into a nation. Their vision was never merely about conquest or crowns. It was about faith, culture, and unity. The declaration of Twelver Shi'ism did more than centralize power, it created a shared identity that defined Persia. The Safavids gave Iran borders that would last centuries, a religious foundation that shaped society, and a cultural memory rich with art, architecture, poetry, and ceremony. The cities, mosques, and palaces they built were more than structures, they were statements. This is Persia, this is Iran, and it will endure. But the story of the Safavids is also a cautionary tale. The very instruments that built the dynasty, faith, loyalty, and fire, also contained the seeds of its destruction. Paranoia, clerical dominance, harem intrigues, and intolerance gradually hollowed the state from within. The same devotion that inspired armies and inspired culture eventually trapped the dynasty in fear and rigidity. The Afghan blade, the siege of Isfahan, the surrender of Sultan Hussein, these were consequences of decades of internal decay, reminding us that power, when exercised without balance, can destroy even the greatest of empires. Yet, despite their fall, the Safavids' legacy lives on. Modern Iran is, in many ways, the child of their vision. Shia Islam remains the spiritual foundation of the nation. Persian art, architecture, and urban planning still echo Abbas's borders drawn and defended during their era form the skeleton of modern Iran. In every minaret, every public square, every story passed down through generations, the Safavid imprint endures. So why do the Safavids still matter? Because they show us how faith can build a nation, and how fear and intolerance can destroy it. They remind us that the most powerful empires are not only made with swords, wealth, and strategy, but also with vision, inclusion, and the ability to balance authority with humanity. If you've enjoyed this deep journey into the rise, glory, and fall of the Safavid Dynasty. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel Past Picture, and turn on the notification bell. We dive into history with storytelling, cinematic detail, and insights that connect the past to today. Your support helps us continue exploring the stories that shape the world. The Safavids are gone, their empire in ruins, but the story of faith, ambition, culture, and caution remains alive. Persia was forged in fire, devotion, and sometimes blood, and the echoes of their dynasty will resonate across centuries, reminding us that history is never just about rulers, but about the ideas, identities, and legacies they leave behind.